So there's a dragon in this house. Now the next thing you might wonder is, how often have you actually gone into a house where there's a dragon? My guess is if you don't take this particularly specifically and allow yourself to use your imagination and to think metaphorically for a moment, you've all encountered dozens of houses that were filled right to the rafters with various dragons, all of which were being studiously ignored by the people who inhabited the house.
Now, how quick?
There's this thing that exists, this multi-headed snake, and it's got this infinity problem. It's everywhere. That's that little circle down there. And the problem is, well, what do you do with it? You cut off one head, 7 more grow. That's the eternal problem of life. And the problem is, there is the category of problems in life, and it ain't going anywhere. And so the question is, can you deal with the whole category at the same time? That's the thing. That's how to be in the world, is to deal with that category all at the same time. And so how did human beings, what did they come up with as a solution? And that's so cool too, because the solution they come up with not only was the heroism that allows you to approach what you're terrified by and what you find offensive and to learn from it, but also the idea of sacrifice. And that was played out by cultures everywhere, including human sacrifice. And you think, what the hell was up with those crazy bastards so long ago? They were sacrificing to gods all the time. What kind of clueless behavior was that? Burn something and please God. Burn something valuable and please God. It's like, what was with them? What were they thinking? Well, they weren't stupid, those people. If they were stupid, we wouldn't be here. They were not stupid, and believe me, they lived under a lot harsher conditions than we do. So those were some tough people, man. You know, back then you'd last about 15 minutes. So you don't want to be thinking of your ancestors as stupid. Like, there's no real evidence that we're much different cognitively than we were 150,000 years ago. So anyways, sacrifice. What does that mean, sacrifice? Well, it's a discovery, man. It's the discovery of the future. It's like the future is actually the place where there is threat. And it's always going to be there. So what do? You make sacrifices in the present so that the future is better. Right. Everyone does that. That's what you're doing right now. That's what you're doing here. That's what your parents are doing when they pay money to send you to university. They think, you can bargain with reality. It's amazing. You can bargain with reality. You can forestall gratification now. And it'll pay off at a place and time that doesn't even exist yet. It's like, who would have believed that? It's like, that's a miracle that that occurs. And it's not like people just figured that out overnight. You know, we were chimps, for Christ's sake. Like, how are we going to come up with an idea like that? Well, it's like, well, we thought about it for 7 million years. And, you know, we got to the point where we could kind of act it out. But we didn't know what we were doing. But it emerged as like a dream. So the terror of the future is a dream. And the solution to the terror, the dream of the terror of the future, is another dream. And it comes out in mythology and in fantasy and in drama, where you act out the sacrifice. And then it's a step on the way to full understanding. So we can say sacrifice now instead of doing it, you know, although we still do it. It's just not concretized like it used to be. We do it abstractly. And we all have faith that it will work. You know, and we also set up our society so that it'll work. And one thing about, you know, I'm not a fan of moral relativism for a variety of reasons, partly because I think it's an extreme form of cowardice. But anyways, apart from that, no. There's minimal ways that you can set up a society that will work. And so one of them is that the society has to be set up so that your sacrifices will pay off, or you won't work, and then the society will die. And so it has to make promises. People have to make promises to one another. And that's what money is. Money is a promise that your sacrifice will pay off in the future. That's what money is. And so if the society is stable, you can store up your work right now. You can sacrifice your impulses and you can work and you can store up credit for the future. And then you can make the future a better place. But society has to be stable enough to allow for that. Hyperinflation will do you in. So the promise that's implicit in the currency is the promise that what you're doing now will pay off in the future. And if people don't have that promise, then, well, we know what they do. Because in gangs, for example, in, say, gangs in North America, the time horizon of the gang members shrinks rapidly because they don't really expect to be alive much past 21. And so they get really impulsive and violent. And like, why the hell not? That's what you do when the future doesn't matter, when it's not real. You default back to living in the moment, and you take what you can get right now. And no wonder, because you don't know if you're going to be around in a year. And you get whatever you can while you can bloody well get it. And that's like anarchy, that state. And so you don't want to live in, some people like to live in that state because they're really wired for that, you know. And so they're much more comfortable in those conditions. They're kind of like warrior types, I would say, in some sense. But, you know, for most people, that's just, well, that stress will just do you in, you know, the stress of a life like that. So
she calmed down and went back to sleep. Why? Well, because dreams concentrate on threat. We know that. They present threats to you, threats you haven't been able to deal with well. There's a part of your brain that tracks threats, and it's not really all that smart in some ways. All it does is say, look, here's the problem. And it's waiting for the rest of your brain to conjure up some solution to that problem. And if it doesn't conjure up a solution, then it just presents the problem over and over and over and over and over. So people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, who've been really upset by their contact with something unexpected, dream about the same tragedy forever until they solve it. And they solve it by facing it and living it over and over, voluntarily. So you might think right off the bat from listening to that little story that suggesting to your 4-year-old daughter who's just had a nightmare that her fears aren't real and that the dream representation of them isn't real because it's not tangible like a table might not really be the best approach to the problem. So you see, Billy, he's pretty much got it right off the bat, right? The dragon wagged its tail happily when Billy patted its head. Billy went downstairs to tell his mother. There's no such thing as a dragon, said Billy's mother, and she said it like she meant it. So there's a dragon in this house. Now the next thing you might wonder is, how often have you actually gone into a house where there's a dragon? My guess is if you don't take this particularly specifically and allow yourself to use your imagination and to think metaphorically for a moment, you've all encountered dozens of houses that were filled right to the rafters with various dragons, all of which were being studiously ignored by the people who inhabited the house. Billy went back to his room and began to dress. The dragon came close to Billy in a friendly manner and wagged its tail, but Billy didn't pat it. If there's no such thing as something, it's silly to pat it on the head. Billy washed his face and hands and went down to breakfast. The dragon went along. It was bigger now, almost the size of a dog. Billy sat down at the table. The dragon sat down on the table. This sort of thing was not usually permitted, but there wasn't much Billy's mother could do about it. She'd already said there was no such thing as a dragon. And if there's no such thing, you can't tell it to get down off the table. Sometimes I sit with friends of mine who have very young children to eat, say. And the children, 2 or 3 years old, don't sit at the table, they sit on the table, or they run around the table, or they run around the table and pull things off the table, or they run around the house and pull things off all the shelves in the house and keep their parents so busy chasing them around that they have no time whatsoever to interact as adults. Well, you have to wonder under those circumstances whether you're dealing with a child or a dragon, so to speak. And you also might wonder whether or not the dragon is large and unruly, precisely because the parents are completely unwilling to admit that it actually exists. Mother made some pancakes for Billy, but the dragon ate them all. Mother made some more, but the dragon ate those too. Mother kept making pancakes until she ran out of batter. Billy only got one of them, but he said that's all he really wanted anyway. One time, an acquaintance of ours in Boston brought their son over to be babysat at our house, and his nanny had just been in a car accident, so he was being shunted from house to house while his parents went off to work. And he didn't have a very good reputation, this kid. He was about 4. And he came over to our house and with his mother in the morning, and she dropped him off, and she said, well, he probably won't eat all day, but that's all right. And I thought, no, he's 4. If he doesn't eat all day, that's not all right, right? Because kids, if they don't eat, they're basically horrible, right? If they don't sleep and they don't eat, they're horrible. So it isn't all right that he doesn't eat. So then you think, well, maybe there's some sort of dragon associated with this child that happens to be interfering perhaps with his ability to eat. So I came back at noon. My wife had taken care of the children that day, and I walked in the house, and the other 4 or 5 kids that we had in the house were off playing, and this little kid was standing in the corner, like really isolated and looking, you know, upset fundamentally. So I went over and I poked him a bunch, because generally if you poke a kid a little bit, you know, well, they'll go like this, you know, they'll sort of back off, but sooner or later you can crack them and they'll smile and then they'll play. Not this kid, boy, there's no bloody way he's going to play with me, and that was that. Like, he'd already learned that adults should either be ignored or that they were trouble, and he wasn't going to let any adult into his little world. So there was absolutely a dragon associated with that little boy, and it was eating all his pancakes. Billy went upstairs to brush his teeth. Mother started clearing the table. The dragon, who was quite as big as Mother by this time, made himself comfortable on the hall rug and went to sleep. I really like this one. By the time Billy came back downstairs, the dragon had grown so much he filled the hall. Billy had to go around by way of the living room to get to where his mother was. I didn't know dragons grew so fast, said Billy. There's no such thing as a dragon, said Mother firmly. Cleaning the downstairs took Mother all morning. What with the dragon in the way and having to climb in and out of windows to get from room to room. So, you know, you think back in your own experience when you've gone to a house where there's a dragon hiding underneath the living room rug and nobody's saying anything about it. And then you think, how long does it take to get something absolutely simple done in a house that's absolutely jammed to the rafters with unfinished business? Forever, right? Organizing people in a household like that, to even do something as simple as go out for breakfast in the morning, or even perhaps to make a meal, is virtually impossible. Why? Well, because there's something going on in the household that has been studiously ignored for a very long time and has grown so large as a consequence that it occupies the whole domain. By noon, the dragon filled the house. Its head hung out the front door, its tail hung out the back door, and there wasn't a room in the house that didn't have some part of the dragon in it. When the dragon awoke from his nap, he was hungry. The bakery truck went by. The smell of fresh bread was more than the dragon could resist. He ran down the street after the bakery truck. The house went along, of course, like the shell on a snail. The mailman was just coming up the path with some mail for the Bixbys when their house rushed past him and headed down the street. He chased the Bixbys' house for a few blocks, but he couldn't catch it. When Mr. Bixby came home for lunch, the first thing he noticed was that his house was gone. Luckily, one of the neighbors was able to tell him which way it went. You know, that sort of thing happens to people not infrequently too, right? They're not really looking around much at what's going on, and they come home from work one day and their house is gone. Now, what does that mean? Well, maybe their children have become completely alienated from them, or maybe their wife has decided suddenly, but of course not so suddenly, to leave. Why? Well, according to this story, it's because something ignored was growing in the house. Mr. Bixby got in his car and went looking for the house. He studied all the houses as he drove along. Finally, he saw one that looked familiar. Billy and Mrs. Bixby were waving from an upstairs window. You know, in the 1890s in India, when a house was being built, the local priest, equivalent to the priest, would come by to set the foundation stone, and when he set the foundation stone, he'd take a big spike and drove it into the ground. And the reason he drove it into the ground at the place where the foundation was going to be laid was to keep the great dragon that is underneath the earth firmly pinned down by its head so it couldn't move and shake the house to bits. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means the same thing that's meant in the New Testament when you're told not to build your house on a foundation of sand, right? It doesn't matter how good the house is or how well constructed it is or how rich it is, if the foundation is made out of sand or if it rests on top of the dragon, there's nothing in that household that's ever going to be accomplished that's positive. And the wealthy display that the house might consist of is nothing but a sham. Mr. Bixby climbed over the dragon's head onto the porch roof and through the upstairs window. "How did this happen?" Mr. Bixby asked. "It was the dragon," said Billy. "There's no such thing," Mother started to say. "There is a dragon," Billy insisted, "a very big dragon." And Billy patted the dragon on the head. The dragon wagged its tail happily. Then, even faster than it had grown, the dragon started getting smaller. Soon it was kitten size again. "I don't mind dragons this size," said Mother. "Why did it have to grow so big?" "I'm not sure," said Billy, "but I think it just wanted to be noticed." So the first thing you might think about is just what happens if you don't pay a bill? Like, really don't pay it, right? I mean, when it first comes in, it's only the size of a kitten. But if you leave it alone for 2 or 3 years, it pretty much grows into a full-fledged dragon. Why? Well, because things that you ignore have a life of their own, complex life, like a bill. Bill's attached to a whole industrial complex, right? One of whose major functions is to make sure that you pay the bill. And if you don't pay the bill, then you immediately find out what it's connected to. It's connected to something immense and very troublesome, and if you allow the full force of that thing to manifest itself, it's not pretty. So one lesson from this story is that if something's nagging at you just a bit, it's probably better to deal with it before it turns into a full-fledged dragon. And then you might think, well, what if it's already a full-fledged dragon, right? I mean, then what's your option? Is there nothing left but to run away? And so then I can tell you what we know from 50 years of studying the outcome of clinical psychological interventions. So let's take an extreme case, right? Let's say something truly terrible has happened to you, and as a consequence of that, you're in shock, post-traumatic shock, which is a condition that's sufficiently serious to damage your brain over time. It's not only a psychological disorder, it's a physical disorder. If you're really stressed, your cortisol levels shoot up. And if your cortisol levels shoot up, that cortisol in high doses is a neurotoxin, starts to damage your brain. So let's take a very extreme case and imagine that you've been violently sexually assaulted, and as a consequence of that, you're in post-traumatic shock. How do you get cured? So that means you can't really go outside. You certainly can't encounter anything that's associated with the event. Your sense of integrity and personal safety has been completely destroyed. Is there any way you can get back on your feet? No, there's a woman named Edna Foa in New York, I think one of the world's top clinical psychologists, and she's been dealing with women who have post-traumatic stress disorder for decades. And she's found a treatment that works. And the treatment is this. She has the women relive the event in as much detail as possible, over and over in their imagination, with the accompanying emotion. And she's found, because she's done physiological measurements on her clients, that those women that allow themselves to get the most fully upset as a consequence of the reliving get better faster and stay better longer. The clinical evidence is absolutely clear. When you take someone to therapy, you're basically doing two things to them. Well, three. You allow them to confess what's wrong with them, because it's really useful to actually say what it is that's bothering you. It makes it clear and distinct. You help the person get their story straight, because you have to have your story straight, right? You have to know where you're coming from, and you have to know where you're going, because otherwise there's no structure for your life. And the third thing is, if your path from point A to B is being blocked by something that you're afraid of, you better learn to confront it, because if you don't, it will grow and expand until it turns into the kind of dragon that occupies your whole house. If there's such a thing as being enlightened, let's say, then why isn't everyone enlightened? If it's just a matter of taking the glorious route and following your bliss, let's say, it's like, well, that sounds pretty easy. Why isn't everyone enlightened? But Jung's thinking isn't like that at all. You know, he believed that in order to transform your personality, that first of all you had to be disciplined, that's for sure, but you also had to integrate that part of you that was terrible and capable of breaking rules and make it part of you. And so then, and I really like that idea. Well, here's an example. So about 20 years ago, I would say, there was a newspaper headline in one of Canada's major newspapers, and it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Lloyd Axworthy, and he was talking about what had happened with Milosevic in the former Soviet Union in Yugoslavia, and the atrocities that were being committed. And he said that he was caught unawares by that because he didn't have the imagination for that kind of evil. And I thought, well, you know, you think that what you're doing is signaling your virtue by making a statement like that, but from my perspective, all you're doing is stating your cowardice and your historical ignorance, because if you're going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, you bloody well better have imagination for that kind of evil, because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you. And so you know, again, in the Harry Potter stories, you see he's touched by evil, right? He actually has a soul fragment that's embedded within him that's as black as anything can possibly be. That's why he could talk to snakes. But without that, he wouldn't be able to have any victory. And that's exactly right psychologically. Unless you can think the way that an evil person thinks, then you're defenseless against them, because they'll go places you can't imagine, and then they win. And so the best men I've met, it was interesting even when I was in junior high and high school, because most of my friends dropped out, you know, by the time they were grade 10, thereabouts. And a lot of them were guys who developed physically. They're pretty powerful, and they're just damn sick of putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. It's like, you know, they're not doing that anymore. One of my friends got kicked out when he sort of challenged the gym teacher, you know, physically. And the gym teacher, he could do an iron cross. He was a tough guy, and so it was no trivial matter for my friend to stand up to him, but he got expelled anyways. But, you know, I noticed that it wasn't, it was often the kids whose character I admired that either quit or got expelled, and they were the tougher guys who were just sick and tired of following rules that didn't take into account their character, and then they'd go off and work in the oil rigs or whatever. And you could do that in Alberta at that time. That was really hard work, you know, so it wasn't like they were necessarily taking the easy path. But like, a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And you know, you also see that like one of the central female stories, let's say, if the hero archetype is the central male story, there are variants of hero archetypes that are relevant to women, and one of them is Beauty and the Beast. And you know, Beauty isn't interested in the guy who isn't the Beast. She's interested in the guy who's the Beast, and that's exactly right, but she's interested in the guy who's the Beast that can be civilized and disciplined, right, and who can use that in the service, well, let's say, of a family. And that's exactly, well, that's exactly how it should be.
Mate. We
Well-
can't trust that.
Well, that's the question. Is
People talk about it like it's a neutral thing, but it's just a conglomeration of interests of the powerful.
well, it's a bunch of things. I mean, it's that, it can be that, but it can also be the way that we collectively value things. Like, let me give you an example.
Yeah, but look at our collective values, and I'll just quickly say this.
Yep.
Because I heard this thing in Sweden. They regulate and control access to alcohol at a state level. Like off licenses or liquor stores, they're sort of socially run, and like they're not allowed to be advertised in Sweden. You know, Sweden, I guess, is one of those havens of what you, Mike, I don't know what your views are of Sweden, but I see a lot of stories about Sweden that seem a bit like, I don't know, with Sweden comes across as this, I guess, a sort of this sort of postmodern democracy almost in some respects. Anyhow, like I thought it was curious that they control alcohol in that manner, and I envisaged that sort of breweries and liquor distributors would say, hey, that's not free market, you're controlling access to, you know, people's access to alcohol, as if somehow the free market was neutral. But there is no neutral. if the market is what has the power, people's desires will be overly stimulated. If people have McDonald's advertised at them or alcohol advertised at them, people will bloody eat McDonald's and alcohol. There has to be some moralizing force. There has to be something that's not economically led, that's not the manifestation of greed, that's in the conversation. Someone in a secular society where there is no reasonable or trusted voice of God has to be able to say, don't drink too much alcohol or eat too much McDonald's. So as people will.
Okay, so see, I think the most effective solution to that problem is to have the economic system run, let's say, by distributed individuals who are themselves aiming at a higher good. So I think the most effective way of regulating the market, so to speak, is to improve the moral character of the people who make up the market, rather than directly regulating the market. And not that the market doesn't necessarily need some regulation, because you might say, well, how about we don't devote alcohol advertising to children under 10? Most people would agree that that's a reasonable perspective, and so that is limitation on market forces. And there are places that you can find that limitation being accepted by almost anyone. But part of what you're pointing to is that if the only thing that's governing the market is concern for pure market success, then the market can produce all sorts of excesses. But I think what you want is to help orient people towards a transcendent good that's over and above market interest. So you might say, well, what interest should you serve as you're trying to be successful as a comedian, and while you're trying to make a living as a comedian, say? You might want to make sure that you're conducting yourself appropriately in the marketplace. You're concerned about yourself, but also your future selves. Because you have to and that's partly why addiction is such a catastrophe, right? Because it's great in the short term, but it's not so good in the medium to long run. So you have to take care of yourself and your iterations through the future. You have to take care of yourself in a way that you're taking care of your family. You have to take care of yourself and your family in a way that you're benefiting the community. And that should be foremost in your mind. So then when you start to make economic decisions, even in your business, you're not saying, well, I'm going to do whatever I can to make as much money as I can. You're going to say, I'm going to do whatever I can to make as much money as I can, while also making sure that I'm taking care of myself and my future selves and my family and my community, and being like grateful for all of that and serving it properly. And then I think the market can work more effectively, but still might require some discussion around the edges, because nothing is simple. So the reason that I'm concentrating on the individual and individual development is because I think that's the best way to do that regulation.
I think that's important. I think it's non-negotiable. I think it's necessary. But I also believe that if you have a society that's predicated on some of the worst aspects of human behaviour, lust, desire, fear, if lust, fear and desire are so high in the mix, if you're continually being prompted towards onanism and consuming, I think it's that individual improvement will be insufficient. I feel that your success is, I don't know what it's based on, but I feel that to a degree you've contacted people and, oh yeah, I can improve my own life, I can have a bit of personal authority and autonomy, and I think that's hugely positive. But if every time you step out of your house, if every time you interface with society or pick up your phone or look at a screen, the aspect of yourself that's being nurtured, that's being invited to participate, are the lower aspects of your nature, because those are the most successful routes to a person's decision-making impulses, then I think that it's difficult to succeed. I think it's difficult for these individual projects to succeed. I think that certain people will that message will take hold, but others that it won't. So, to some degree, I feel like I ain't like a big fan of regulation. I understand your irritation about what's being like this sort of a post-modern deconstructionalist argument of let's destroy God, let's destroy all categories, man, woman, none of it's real. I believe in essence, the humours, the deities, the gods. I feel these things are present, but I feel that we're already being subject to a kind of invisible tyranny, that it's already happening, and I don't think it's happening as a result of like some critical theory, post-Marxist. Like, I feel that that's not where power is. That feels like it's sort of bullshit, we could but it doesn't feel like it's as fucking powerful as GlaxoSmithKline, or like it's not as powerful as Halliburton, or like that's what I'm interested in, is power. real power and how power is functioning and how power is negatively impacting ordinary people.
Well, I think it's perfectly reasonable to point out that there might be multiple ways that people experience tyrannical oppression. You know, because every hierarchy is going to tilt towards tyrannical form in its own particular way. And so I've been concerned about what's happening in the university on the radical left. And your concern, the concern that you just brought up, is something like overwhelming large-scale corporate dominance. And I think that's also a reasonable set of concerns. You know, it might not be for the best, for example, that all of our communication is filtered through Google. That might be a bit too much. The question is, the question always is what we can do about it. And I think there's an answer to that, actually. The answer is we can leave people's ability to communicate untrammeled, and so that's why I'm an advocate of free speech. We can leave people's ability to communicate untrammeled so that we can have intelligent discussions about those problems as they emerge and hopefully work towards solutions. Because we can't just generate a structure of rules that says, well, here's the 10 rules that are going to deal with that complex situation. Because things change too rapidly for that. And the reason that freedom of speech, as far as I'm concerned, is the paramount freedom, the paramount right, also the paramount moral obligation, is because it's through our ability to exchange exchange honest opinions that we participate in the process that enables us to keep tyranny of the sort that you described and the sort that I described at bay. And so part of the reason that I've taken the tack I have politically is because, well, my government had the gall to implement compelled speech legislation without noticing what it was that they were interfering with. Because you might say, well, that's pretty much the end of it. How do you keep tyranny at bay? The proper exchange of ideas between free individuals keeps tyranny at bay. That's the best we've got. It doesn't work perfectly. That's also, I think, a gift that England, in large part, has given to the rest of the world, to formalize and codify that, to put it into a body of law, to erect governmental structures that are really predicated on that idea. It's a remarkable achievement, and it's something we should be profoundly grateful for.
Thank you. I want to talk to you about taking that, accepting praise on the behalf of England there. As an English person, I accept that. There are two dragons then. There is the inner and the, at least until we reach some non-dualistic utopia where everything is one. There is the inner dragon of our own desires and fears. But I suppose, like, when we're talking about management of resources, is that phrase that came up earlier? Like, that where does the attention need to go? And it's difficult, like, you know, me, I suppose there's something about my background that has led me to identify as the dragon, oh, it's consumerism, it's turning people into consumers, because obviously as an addict, that's what I am, a consumer, an ultra consumer. And it seems that you, with your background in academia, this neo-Marxist post, because like when I sort of like think about aspects of socialism, e.g., you know, people are working too hard, you should only work 4 hours a day, there should be time for fishing in the afternoon, which I think is in Das Kapital. I think he talks about fishing in the afternoon. You know, for me, that seems like a very beautiful and fair and just idea. Also, I don't see them, like, whilst I can imagine that they're irritating on a campus, particularly for somebody who's researched such a lot, I don't see them as powerful. That's part of my intrigue. I suppose it's comparable to when I was talking to Sam Harris, another person who I admire, but whom I go, oh yeah, but I don't like, you know, like when I'm talking to Sam Harris about Islam, I go, yeah, but when, like, how is Islam gonna, like I feel like even if you talk about Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism, like, Saudi Arabia is an economic entity, they're not an Islamic entity in terms of let's go do some Islam. It's like let's go do some business, no? And like, and so I suppose here, well,
well, I'm concerned mostly. I'm concerned mostly with the emphasis on the collective identity rather than the individual identity. Like the process that you just described, I would say, and this is the answer to the question that we posed at the beginning of our conversation: is there something universal about the process that you laid out? And I think there is. And I think it's at the core of individual development. And I think it's the most powerful of forces. And so I think that the individual should be regarded as the proper locus of evaluation. And the problem I have with the postmodern neo-Marxist types, apart from the fact that their analysis tends to lead to a kind of nihilism, is that because they're making the group the paramount level of analysis, this sort of thing gets ignored. And what I'm trying to do in my work, we have a program called the self-authoring program that kind of steps people through these 12 steps that you just described. The first thing that people do is write about their past, all the emotional experiences. The second thing they do is take an inventory of their personality faults and virtues so that they can rectify the faults and capitalize on the virtues. And the third thing they do is chart a course for the future that takes them into account and others. And so, and I see it as a reflection of this universal process that you just described. And I think it's the most powerful form of transformation. But more importantly, I also think it's the one that risks doing the least harm. Like, it hasn't hurt anybody that you've put yourself together. It's just good, right? It's good for you. It's good for the people that know you. There's nothing about it. And it's the right level of humility, because you took what you knew to be wrong in your experience. You took personal responsibility for it. You made changes for yourself. You didn't go around pointing the finger at what was wrong with the external world and trying to fix it. Now, look, it could easily be that once you have your act together, or maybe even before, you should be doing some things to adjust political systems or sociological systems. But the problem with that is, what makes you think you can trust yourself? You know, and it's like, well, I'm compassionate. It's like, maybe you're also envious of the successful. And the probability of that's pretty damn high, by the way. And so you better know before you express that compassion, especially in the political domain, whether or not that is contaminated by things about yourself that you haven't contended with.
Do you think an honest declaration along those lines, or specifically that, in the political field would be refreshing?
Look, I'll tell you this is a very funny thing. So the emperor of ancient Mesopotamia, so this is some of the earliest political documentation we have, by the way. Here's what they used to do to the emperor. Every New Year's Day, they would take him outside the walls of the city. So he was responsible for everything within the walls. Outside was chaos and the unknown. They'd take him outside the city. They'd strip him of all his emperor garb, so he's no longer emperor. They'd make him kneel. They'd humiliate him. I think, if I remember correctly, the priest would hit him with a glove and say, okay, in the last year, name all the ways that you didn't embody Marduk. Marduk was the god of the Mesopotamians, and Marduk was the thing that took on the great dragon of chaos. And so it was the responsibility of the emperor to kneel down and say, here's all the ways that I haven't been acting out my proper self and have brought the kingdom into disarray. And then he would be forgiven. They would act out the reconstruction of the cosmos. That was the New Year's celebration. And then he'd go in and try to be a good king. So yeah, no kidding, absolutely. It's like the confession of the emperor. Here's the way I haven't been good.
Are there any comparable, are the powerful held up to that kind of evaluation in?
We don't have
any
rituals for
form now?
that. Well, I
Because
think
we don't acknowledge the emergence of order from chaos. We don't acknowledge divine principles. So the powerful, and I think this is possibly because of an assumed meritocracy. That, you know, people that are in positions of power, they're there for a reason. You don't need to start stripping them naked and taking them outside the city and saying, how often did you wank in that Oval Office? Every day. Get out.
Yeah, well, I think there might be something to that, and that's the danger of pride that goes along with ascension in a hierarchy. Well, because I'm here in this position, I must deserve it. It's like, yeah, but there should still be something that you're bowing down to. And that might be the abstract idea of sovereign authority itself, if you think about it only psychologically. That's a figure that essentially has a touch of divinity about it, because it's the
monarchy.
perfect ideal.
We're in a monarchy right now, huh? So that's the queen, the anointed and appointed monarch. She represents, you know, but I suppose in a post-secular nation, she becomes the emblem of Britain rather than the emblem of God on.
Right. Well, I think it actually functions to some degree in
the same way.
Well, I do think so, because the queen, your queen in particular, our queen as well, because I'm Canadian.
Canadian.
You know, I mean, I think
That's
Elizabeth has been an embodiment of moral virtue. I mean, she's done a remarkable job over the last, 75 years now. She's held herself to an incredibly high moral standard, and I think she does sit in the background as emblematic of what sovereign authority might look like.
But of course, you're postmodernist, and this is an area where, because I'm English, and I can't get away from the love of the Queen. But I would also say that she is an emblem of authority and of power and of wealth and land ownership, and that there is an order that ought to be respected and can't be challenged. Every so often, this country sort of toys with the idea of republicanism. They're always grateful when there's a wedding, like there is this week, so that no one has to think, is this right that we're paying for this bizarre this spectacle?
Yeah, well, but it is useful to think about it in a symbolic sense. I mean, one of the things that constantly threatens the United States, I think there should be 4 branches of government: legislative, judicial, executive, and symbolic. Because the problem in the United States is the president keeps tilting towards king. You know, the Americans like the idea of the first family and the first lady, and it's like, yeah, no, and it kind of tilts towards a dynasty, and you've seen that happen with the Bushes and the Clintons. It's not a good thing, and it might be nice to have someone take the symbolic load off the president and just act that out, and your Queen does that very nicely, because all of the pomp and circumstance of the state and all the drama and ritual of the sovereign can be played out in that sort of dramatic space, and your legislature and executive branches can go off and do the administration.
It's interesting that the dynasties exert themselves. In a sense, it's a demonstration of your argument that there are certain hierarchical systems that find their way into fruition regardless of regulation, but then I suppose there's rational reasons. They would have the resources, the experiences, the connections.
Sure, it's easier for them, but that's also that's a danger to a republic, is the fact that, and it's part of the potential corruption of the state, is that, well, it's easier for the children of those who have authority to have power, and you don't want people attaining the pinnacle of achievement because of power. You want them attaining the pinnacle of achievement because of competence. Yeah, and those things always struggle. They it takes a society that's very awake to stop the hierarchies from degenerating into hierarchies of power.
Because degeneration is the tendency.
Sure, well, it's easy. It's
You
easy,
quote that
right?
W.B. Yeats poem, that fearsome and terrifying, the Faulkner poem.
Well, and people have recognized that it's the proclivity of hierarchies towards tyranny for thousands of years. I've seen that as a fundamental danger to proper adaptation. We need hierarchies, yes, but they degenerate into tyranny and they unfairly oppress. It's like, yes, we have to be on guard against that, but that doesn't mean that we call all hierarchies tyrannies, because that's not helpful, or we call all productive activity service service to the oppressive patriarchy, because that's seriously not helpful, and we don't dispense with hierarchies because then people don't have anything to do. So,
yes. So it's get the beam out your eye, huh? Like so if the individual is attuned, if the individual is a channel, I like the prayer of St. Francis. I like it as a model that it invites us to find the reverse of each defective characteristic or sin that we might be living out, to become a channel of some inherent goodness.
Well, the thing that's one of the things that's interesting about that, well, 2 things actually. The first is the word sin means to miss the target. It's an archery term, so that's a very interesting way of thinking about it, because it means that
There is a target.
there is a target. That's the thing. But the next thing is, and this comes right out of that, is it's very useful to become aware of your faults, because as soon as you posit a fault, you posit the opposite. By merely saying, well, that's a fault, you're saying implicitly, well, there's something that's the opposite of that. So out of your recognition of faults, immediately some clarity of virtue develops. Because you might say, well, this is a fault and I really know it. It's like, great, you've got some bedrock there. Whatever the opposite of that fault is, you might not know what that is, but whatever the opposite of that fault is a virtue. And then you might say, well, I have 20 faults. It's like, great. The opposite of the personality that has all those 20 faults is the virtuous you, whatever that might happen to be. Well, great. Then you've conjured out of the devil a redeemer. It's something like that.
I like that. Undoubtedly, both in terms of cosmology and fleeting morality, there is chaos, there is vastness, but there are also patterns. There are patterns that emerge, and whether you call that pattern male or love or beauty, there are various patterns. And I feel that there is something to get in alignment with. There is a tune, there is harmony, there is melody, there is grace. We're not
That's all
dealing
expressed
with
in
just
music,
nothingness.
and all you're using are musical what do you call it, analogies, musical representations. That's what music expresses, is to have all of that in harmony.
Yes,
And people
beyond
love music
language.
because of that. You know, and those patterns, because music, you think about music, it is the harmonious interaction of patterns. And you just described all those positive, what would you call them, spirits, that's a good way of thinking about it, as patterns. Well, they are patterns. Then you might think that there's a pattern that's composed of all of those patterns. Well, that's what you're after. You're after the pattern that's composed of all those patterns. Yes, absolutely. And you want to put yourself in harmony with that. And that is a real thing. That's a real thing. You can feel that. So it's what keeps you alive, essentially, when you're trying to become conscious.
Yes, yes, there is something important happening. I feel that, like what we were saying before about the acknowledgement of difference needn't infer inferiority. That is something that we must
Definitely
invite.
not. Well, we should be actually, well, this is part of what the radical leftists keep saying is, oh, we should celebrate diversity. It's like, yes, but what that means first is the admission that people actually differ. Otherwise, you don't have diversity. It's like, I'm glad there are conservatives. I'm glad there are leftists. The conservatives run things. The leftists invent them. It's like, good. And they're really different, those people. Like, you know, if you have a group that's all conservatives and they're going down the right path, they're going to go down that path really fast. But if they're going down the wrong path, they're not going to be able to think laterally and figure out how to get out of it. If you have a group of left-leaning creative types, it's like they're going to come up with 100 ideas. But the probability that they'll organize in a stable hierarchy and implement those effectively is zero. So they're going to have to call over the conservatives. It's like, look, guys, we finally got a good idea. You can have one idea, because you're conservatives, run with it. And then they can all run with it. And so it's really good that we have people who are like that on both sides of the distribution, because otherwise the creative types would sit around and come up with new ideas till they starve to death in squalor.
Those potheads.
Yeah, well, exactly. And the conservatives would just ossify and you know, run down a road that got narrower and narrower and narrow, and they'd all end up stuck between two cliffs. And that'd be the end of it for both of them.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. We require synthesis. This is so. Perhaps
And that's the interplay of opposites, actual opposites.
Yeah. The yin yang, the sort of there needs to be necessary collusion between distinction, but for that to happen, there needs to be acknowledgement and recognition of difference.
Yes.
But in trying to achieve equality with the annihilation of category is not a successful route.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. That is
Cool.
not a successful route.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Jordan Peterson. We have good chats, don't we?
That was great. Yeah, that was really good. Absolutely. Thanks
man.
for inviting me back.
Oh no, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you.
This morning I was discussing the joke of death. And it's going...
It took me a long time to understand what sacrifice meant, because on the surface of it, especially the way it's acted out, like burnt offerings and that sort of thing, it just seems like, well, it seems so archaic and distant from us that it's not really comprehensible. But partly from reading Jean Piaget, and Nietzsche for that matter, I started to understand that people often acted out conceptions before they understood what they meant. You know, and we act out a lot of things we don't understand because we're much more complex than we can represent. So we're always acting out things we don't understand. But So there's this idea in Cain and Abel that you have to make sacrifices in order to stay on the good side of God. And so I thought about that practically, say, not so much metaphysically, but practically, and realized that that was equivalent to the discovery of time, of the future, because we do act, and this is a peculiar discovery of human beings, and maybe a consequence of our expanded intelligence, is that we're actually aware of the future. And we actually treat the future as if it's something that you can bargain with. Now, partly it's because the future is other people, and they remember your reputation, they remember your past actions, and if you do someone a favor, then that favor is in some sense stored up in the future. So you could think about the future as a place of judgment about your moral actions, and it's not that far from that to imagining a God who's keeping track of that, or who even is that. But in any case, the idea of sacrifice emerges in the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain and Abel both make sacrifices to God in order to stay on his good side, let's say. And what a sacrifice means is that you give up something of value in the present so that you can improve the future. And you know, that's no different from what we call discipline. It's exactly the same thing. It's just the concretely acted out version of that. And so, you know, the idea basically was that, well, God was in the transcendent heavens. And the first question would be, well, why is that? And it's like, well, if you go out on a really dark night and look up at the sky, you have a sense of what's beyond you, what's transcendent, what's infinite. And so to associate that with the highest of values is a reasonable association, right, from an emotional point of view. So it's not particularly primitive. It's a smart metaphor, or it's a smart intuition and it's above you. And you know, we tend to think of when you're moving towards an ideal that you're moving up, that you're moving above, you're moving to the mountaintop, right? You're going up, not down. And so it all sits within that same framework, and it's partly because when you go up, like on a mountain, you can see for long distances, right? So all those things are tangled together. So anyways, so the idea is that you have to give up something of value now so that you make the future better. And sometimes it's even something you love now, and that's a good example too, because often the things that stop us from moving forward are our attachments to things that we should no longer be attached to, right? And in fact, you can almost make that definitional. If you're not moving forward in your life, there's a high probability that you have some idea or some mode of action or some habit that you're so in love with that you won't let go of it. So, all right, so Cain and Abel make sacrifices, and there's kind of a hint in the story that it's just a hint that Cain's sacrifices are sort of second rate. But in any case, it's ambivalent, hey? But Abel, he just does wonderfully well, and everything works out for him. And everyone knows people like that, you know. And so God accepts his sacrifices, but for some reason he rejects Cain's. And maybe it's the arbitrariness of God, or maybe it's because Cain's heart isn't in the right place when he's making his sacrifices, which is more likely. And so Cain goes and has a chat with God, and he says, basically what he says is something like, how in the world can you possibly justify this universe that you created? You look at me and I'm breaking myself in half trying to adapt and to make things right, and it's not working. And then there's this Abel character, and things come easy to him, and everything is flourishing for him, and so, like, what the hell? And if you don't understand that question, then you're not thinking, because it's very, very frequently the case when a serious catastrophe besets you in life that you essentially ask exactly that question. What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of the world? How come there's suffering? And it's easy to become resentful and vengeful as a consequence of that. And so you got to think about what state of mind having your sacrifices rejected puts you in, especially when you see someone who's successful, because that's where the jealousy and resentment starts to fester is probably the right word. And so God says to Cain exactly what he doesn't want to hear, which is, well, yeah, okay, but you have made lots of mistakes in your life. So he basically says sin is at your door like a predatory and sexually aroused animal, and you've invited it into your house to have its way with you and produced something creative as a consequence. So he's used a sexual metaphor, you know, and so that you've willingly gone down the negative path. and you've allowed that to enter into you and to operate in a creative manner, and you've spun off all these terrible thoughts and this justification for not acting properly, and that's why things aren't going well for you, and so don't lay that at my feet, which is the most brutal possible message he could have got. And so then he leaves the presence of God, let's say, and it says in the story that his countenance fell, which meant he was basically enraged. And so what does he do? He goes out and kills Abel, and then that's a very fascinating idea, because Abel is his ideal, so he kills his ideal, and when you kill your ideal, you're lost. And then he does that to take revenge on Abel, but also to take revenge on God, which I think is extremely interesting and a deep, deep idea. Like these kids who shoot up high schools, for example, you cannot understand what they're doing unless you understand this story of Cain and Abel. You cannot understand what possesses them until you can understand that someone, even someone who doesn't believe, it doesn't matter, it's the psychological state of mind that matters, is they're out for revenge on being itself. And that's why they produce as much mayhem as possible in the shortest period of time. That's why they sacrifice innocent people, because it's much more vengeful and demonstrative to kill innocent people than to kill guilty people, right? Because it's a worse sin, so to speak. And then they kill themselves. And they kill themselves as a final demonstration of their belief in nihilism and the horror of existence. Because you might say, well, why don't they just kill themselves first and save everyone the trouble? You know, and there's narcissism in that too, because they know their names are going to be splashed across the page. That's their notoriety instead of their accomplishment. And of course, the media is unbelievably complicit in that. So when you're talking about motivation for evil, then you have to understand what it is that's driving it, and it is a deep resentment about the structure of being, for being saturated with suffering, but also for rejecting your sacrifices, and that, you know, that produces the bitterness of failure. And I'll stop with this. One of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament is that, and the Jews in the Old Testament, is that they don't take the path of Cain. Every time they're walloped by God, which is like fairly frequently, they say, we must have done something wrong and we have to set ourselves right. And that's an unbelievably heroic attitude, because that's the alternative to cursing fate. It's like you take the responsibility for failure onto yourself.
The idea that there's any such thing as an objective failure is highly questionable. I don't resonate. Any concept of an objective failure other than the failure to participate in your nature, your epigenetic directives, that is driving hunger. The reason for this is ascertained by examining internal struggle or tension between giving in to that which is essentially natural hunger, epigenetic objectives. That there's a tension within oneself to comprehend fulfillment of these desires. I think Alan Watts reconciles it with the best possible viewpoint when he says, I am these hungers, hooray, this is great. There's nothing pushing me around against what I want. I am this wanting that I contain. But people struggle to reconcile this in that way. They, for some reason, feel that they're in a quest of sorts, a dichotomy of struggle between desires that don't come across in their own ego sense as desirable, as acceptable desires. And I think that's where you start thinking about good and evil and the sacrifice within that construct of what good or evil could be. But in Zen, you easily transcend that dichotomy with a very, very easy question, which essentially allows you to describe human contact as it allows you to point out human contact on the good side as definitively and objectively good, and essentially be an Occam's razor mechanism to point out the goodness of any and all human contact which you can engage, which you can reach for and experience. So if you get the question phrased in that way, in that accurate equation that is depicting human contact, and then you start solving the equation by eliminating, and this is your radical creativity method here, to cancel out anything in the equation that doesn't actually correspond to the essence of the human contact that is ultimately beneficial or ultimately contains actual value, the actual sensation of what you're doing, what you want to do, what you are.
Out there in no man's land, out there in potential, there's threat and like mortal threat, but there's also endless opportunity and riches and wealth and the possibility of attracting someone and all of that. And so, well, the dragon, you can't just be afraid of it, you just stay in your burrow the whole time. And lots of animals more or less do that, you know, especially the nocturnal ones, they just hide away. But that isn't what human beings are like, because we're not only prey animals, right? We're also predators. And then, of course, we're crazy. We're absolutely insane chimpanzees, right? We're crazy. And so we're always out there mucking about with things and with our, you know, fingers and our thumbs and taking the world apart and putting it back together. And we're crazily exploratory and troublemaking. And so we don't just run from dragons, we go hunt them down. And so there's a story here. There's the oldest story that mankind knows, and literally it is the oldest story that we know, is this story. And the story basically is there's a bounded space, a walled garden, a walled city, you know, and all the original cities were walled, because if they weren't, barbarians would swoop in and they'd just steal all your stuff. And so, you know, that was kind of pointless. So, you know, you wanted to have some major league walls surrounding your territory. And so that's inhabited space, and inside that is your little dominance hierarchy. And so all you primates knew exactly who was who inside that space, so you didn't have to fight with each other, and you could predict each other's behavior because you believed the same things and saw the world roughly the same way and acted the same way, and so you were sort of secure. But then the problem is that that can always be breached. There's always something outside of it that's a danger, and so that's signified by this little creature here, this dragon. And that twirl in its tail is very common among dragons. It's actually a symbol, because imagistic languages, imagistic symbols have an ancient language, and it's referring to something that's basically eternal. And see, it lives down here in this cave, because it's an underground thing. It's an underground thing, and you can kind of imagine what that's like. And sometimes this happens in initiation rituals among archaic people. When they're gonna initiate, usually the young men, because nature initiates women all by itself, usually the young men, maybe they'll put them in a cave and leave them there, you know, for like, well, who knows how long. And so you got to think, what's in a cave? And caves are dark, man. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but like they're dark, and they're really dark. And so not only is there whatever there is in the cave, and you don't know what the hell's in the cave, there's whatever you imagine might be in the cave. And so when you're in that cave and you're alone, you're confronting the devils and demons and monsters of your own imagination, you know. And so then you have a chance to perhaps deal with that and overcome it, and that's perhaps part of the initiation ceremony, you know, and that's part of growing up, because you have to learn how to face the things that terrify and upset you and recast them and put them back together. We talked a little bit about this idea of the pre-cosmogonic chaos that Iliad refers to, and that's the stuff out of which order is produced at the beginning of time, and it's also the stuff out of which you constantly reproduce order. And the Jungians, the psychoanalysts, especially the really deep psychoanalysts like Jung, Freud was a more surface psychoanalyst, and that's not an insult. There's some things that Freud figured out that are absolutely amazing. He was a precursor to Jung for sure. For Jung, the hero's journey was the journey inside the unconscious, and that would be perhaps in some sense the willingness to face everything terrible that's happened to you and to think it through and to articulate it and to come to grips perhaps with your own capacity for malevolence. That was a really important part of Jungian ideas, that the first step towards individuation, which is the manifestation of your full self, let's say, was the discovery of your shadow. And your shadow is the part of you that will do terrible things under the right circumstances, and maybe even without that much provocation. And you know, and it's a terrifying part of you to come into contact with, because it's sort of the way that you're specifically attached to the archetype of evil. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you know, modern people, they don't really think much about the idea of good and evil, but that's because most of them are so damn naive, you can just barely even comprehend it. You know, if you read any history, if you really read it, like, and you don't come away with the idea that evil exists, it's like you're just reading the wrong kind of history, you know. It's just unbelievable what people can do to each other. And we're so imaginative, you know. And one of the things I figured out about people, the reason that we have the knowledge of good and evil, let's say, is that because we're self-conscious and we know about ourselves, we know about our own vulnerability, right? You know what hurts you. You really know what hurts you, way more than an animal knows. And you're also creative, and so once you know what hurts you, man, you can really hurt someone else. And you can do it in such a creative way. You can draw it out, you can make it excruciating, you can take people apart physically and psychologically, and you can keep them, say, even right on the edge of death, so that you can keep doing that endlessly. And you know, that happens a hell of a lot more than you think it happens. It happens a lot. And so, well, and you think, well, you know, that doesn't involve me. It's like, oh yes it does, man. That's the problem, because you know, you're human, and that's the sort of things that human beings are capable of. And I'm not saying it's all probable that you do that ever, or that, but I'm saying that, you know, you got to take that into account. When you're looking at the world and you think about all the perpetrators out there, it's not like there's perpetrators and there's victims. That isn't how it works. It doesn't work that way at all. And so the horrors of humanity, as well as the noble elements of humanity, are all elements of your central being. And for Jung, and this is the terrible thing, for Jung, the pathway to higher wisdom was through the terrible portal of, well, you could say hell, for that matter. Really. And so who wants to do that, man? It's like, no. You know, like maybe you're resentful about something. Well, you probably are, because like everybody's resentful about something, you know. And resentment is just a vicious emotion. It's really useful. It's really useful, because if you're resentful about something, it either means that you should grow the hell up and accept the responsibility and quit sniveling around and whining, or it means that someone actually is oppressing you and pushing on you too hard and bullying you and demeaning you, and you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. And no wonder you're not saying or doing it, because, you know, it can be really dangerous to say things or do them to free yourself from being oppressed. You can get in a lot of trouble in the short term for doing it, so it's easier just to not say anything, sort of day after day. In the short term you protect yourself, but it just crushes you. And then the resentment comes up, and resentment, and that can just get so out of hand, you know. It starts with resentment, and then it goes to the desire for revenge,
you know, because you'll play nasty little tricks on the person that's oppressing you. At any chance, you'll talk about them behind their back, and if they want you to do something, you'll do it badly, or you'll do it grudgingly, or you'll do a half-rate job, and you'll set up little traps, and, you know, so it puts you in a poisonous space. And then if you really start to dwell on that, say, in your basement for 3 or 4 years about just exactly how terrible the world is and how that's focused on you and how everyone's rejected you and how you get to this point where you're thinking that, you know, existence itself is a kind of poisonous endeavor, and that the best thing for you to do is go out there and do as much, you know, create as much mayhem as you possibly can. And if you really get to a dark place, you think, I'm going to create as much mayhem as I possibly can by targeting the most innocent thing I can possibly imagine. And so that's a bad road, man. There's dark things down there, but you can go there, and people do, and they go through the hole of resentment. And so resentment can tell you you've got something to say. You bloody well better say it. You gotta free yourself from what's oppressing you. You have to stand up for that, because otherwise you become oppressed, and then once you're oppressed, that's just not so good. And
You're
so,
doing it to
like
yourself
in your
after
marriage
that.
and your relationships, you got to tell people what you're thinking. You don't have to assume you're right. That's a whole different story, because you're not, because you're, you know, ignorant and you're biased, and, you know, so you're not right, but you can stumble towards the expression of yourself, and then you can listen to the other person and hope that they tell you some way that you're stupid that's useful, so you can be a little less stupid in the future, because wouldn't that be good? And so, you know, you go after the unknown. You don't protect what you know. You already know what you know. You go after what you don't know. That's why you have to talk to people you don't agree with. That's why you have to talk to your enemies, because they're going to tell you things you don't know. You could even listen to them. It's possible they know a thing or two you don't know. But people don't like that, you know. They just talk to people who think the same way, and then they just stay stupid.
Dead
So
end.
that's not good, because if you're not wise, the world will wallop you. It'll flatten you, and far more than it has to. And then you'll be bitter and resentful, and you'll be part of that force that wallops instead of the force that fights against that. So, well, so you go after the dragon, and that's what this guy is doing. He's going after the dragon. It's threatening the society, because it always does. Chaos, what's outside of order, always threatens order. Always. Always. And so you have to step forward, you know, in this manner, voluntarily, and go after that when it's still manageable, right? And that's the case in your own life too. So, you know, if you've had a proclivity to be bullied in the past, you know, and you want to get out of that, what you have to do is you have to make yourself awake to the what would you say, to the initial stages of that sort of bullying emerging in your life again, that sort of domination, and you have to step forward against it when it's still in its developing stages, because maybe you can just not have it happen. That would be better. And so you have to be ready to speak what you have to say more or less on a moment's notice. You can't be impulsive about it. You know, like if you and I are talking and you make a mistake, or I make a mistake, even if it bothers one or the other of us, we should just write it off, because it's like one encounter. What the hell? You know, maybe we had a bad night's sleep or something, you know. So you got to be a little forgiving. But if it happens twice, then, you know, you should be a little awake, and you should remember both times. And then if it happens a third time, it's like that's when you act, and you say, look, we talked and this happened, and I thought, yeah, whatever. But then you did it again, and then you just did it again. Well, then the person is basically like, what are they going to do? You know, no. Well, maybe they might argue with you, but you kind of got them. And generally, if you just point that out to people, just like that, just that you noticed and are willing to say something about it, they'll back the hell off. They'll often apologize. And sometimes you even make them a little more conscious, which is like, hey, that's not such a bad idea. And that's what all this means. And so this chaos idea, so for Jung, it was the unconscious, right? It was the contents of your unconscious. And so that might be the unknown past, the threatening past that you have never dealt with. Might be the threatening future. It might be the threatening present. But Jung realized as he got older that the unconscious was also the world. And you think, and so the chaos is not only your unconscious mind, which meets the unknown, but it's actually the unknown itself mingled together. And you think, what the hell does that... That's why the dragon is a land creature and an air creature. It's matter and spirit at the same time. And this sort of gets us into constructivism. Because the constructivists think that basically what happens is that you encounter those elements of the world that don't fit into your theory, and out of those new elements you make the world through your perceptions, and you make yourself by incorporating the information and transforming yourself. And that's how Piaget explains the development of a child. The child starts out with some reflexes, basic reflexes, and manifesting the reflexes produces results in the world, and then the child has to reorganize its perceptions to take into account the transformations, and so then it gets a little more sophisticated, and then it can do a few more things, and then it can manifest more changes in the world, and then it tracks them and modifies its perceptions and actions to account for them, and it just keeps doing that, and that's how the child boots itself up, like a computer does.
Programming. That's age 1 to 7. You just watch. You don't have to do anything. You program automatically. Now what's difficult is when your program involves trauma and neglect. Then you have a serious task of reprogramming to approach. Which I find resonant when Alan Watts says that this is one of the first things that resonated out of his lecture, included in the first Ultra Plateau I've just been editing and contemplating lately. Since it was about 2 months ago, just under 60 days ago, that I put this together as a compilation of the earliest major Watts excerpts that I had encountered. He says that to figure out how to cure the bad effects of what we think of as education, it's absolutely necessary that if we don't figure that out, then we are not succeeding as a metaconscious group of human beings. And my grasp on exactly what he's saying about metaconsciousness would come gradually, come along as I listened to the talks specifically focused on that. Those are the talks that he really explores the educational value of the sensations about death and about fear and about bravery itself, which is, I think, Jordan Peterson spends more time in that headspace exploring. It's more of his main area of interest, whereas I think Watts ended up integrating that into a majority of later talks on organism intelligence, but I didn't have a grasp on it when I first was listening to Watts, and I heard him say that curing the bad effects of education was the challenge, the essential flaw in our current social contract, and I still believe that that's the flaw. If there is one singular flaw, one way of defining the error in the current social contract, it's that education proceeds along in a way that's completely disingenuous to creativity or metaconsciousness or organism intelligence, and then we're all completely mixed up by the time we actually, if we even manage to even get through that in one piece, as it were. You're in a holding pattern, basically. You may go your whole life and never encounter yourself up until that point where you're actually faced with, as he describes in The Inevitable Ecstasy in quite great detail, you're faced with that demise looking you in the face situation. If you actually manage to encounter that and still live to tell the tale, then you've kind of discovered your cure. But what he's saying is that we need to contemplate death and demise, and we need to befriend it. We need to utilize it for reaching the real education plateau that is about organism intelligence. I find that that's the primary singular thread inside of the adventurer philosophy or creative consciousness by way of adventuring and crafting model that I've been thinking about and trying to, in essence, create the tutorial about how to use it, how to think about it, how to engage it, and what are the exact means of playing this game of an adventurer. I was having this thought while listening in on the mega rerun I ran over the last 2 days. It ran just under 2 full run-throughs. I went ahead and stopped it with the last 4 lecture chunks left off on the second time just now, because it would have still been going right now if I hadn't given it a stop point. But what I was thinking about it is... God damn it, that guy despawned while I was trying to get to him for the objective. I was thinking about how I had to gradually realize that the koan essence of Watt's style, his narrative mythos, because they didn't have any such a thing beyond television and film, or, you know, play on the stage. That's it. That's the only kind of gameplay that they had, besides card games and billiards. At the time that he came up with all of this wordcraft, but what he was doing with the wordcraft was literally conveying huge contexts and viewpoints within those contexts to transport the listener to these places, into the gameplay. He was literally crafting gameplay and leaving it there for us to go find and for us to go explore and to absorb the meaning of it from every which perspective that he would happen to spell out across the course of his work. So the realization of that was this process for me of absorbing, of it dawning on me how I found the questions that I'm using and that I have used to develop the entire, every single fragment and particle of what my craft now contains and necessarily involves, from everything from compilation to just writing to narration to how that all is going to fit into gameplay and game design and world building and player experiences. When I get up to the very top of how that's going to work as an actual game, a playable game, I need to say, because it is going to be a game before it's playable. You'll still be able to experience the game via my narration and my content, my segments about it, essentially. But I went through the experience of going to the places that Watts was describing and establishing and transporting me to, and then realizing the questions that were involved in that, and the questions that I had always been asking but didn't note as such. I was asking them without understanding that that's what I was doing. So once I became aware of the questions themselves, that was the point where I started to unravel the whole thing, the whole idea of mythos, craft, and gameplay, and the way these two ideas interact together when you get into the idea about what is crafting, what does it mean, and what is education, what does knowledge mean, what is XP, what's it for, and what does it do, and how do we access it, and how do we harness it. But the earliest thread of that was the feeling like Alan Watts is a character in my game, that he's speaking directly to me as in the Stanley narrator. And I feel like the Stanley Parable created that context, that ability for me to feel spoken to, as an entity in gameplay. But it almost seems like Watts founded the idea, and that vibration came to Davey Reedon when he scribbled all the instructions on the notepad and started building such a game experience. The two seem to mutually arise in my mind of what my game is. The entire Stanley Parable metaphysics and the entire Alan Watts adventure stack, the whole entire thing. These two just arise completely mutually as gameplay in my experience so far. Because what it's about is facing your challenges and locating your skills and understanding what is the physical thing inside your HP and mana bubbles. What is that? What is reality that these items in your inventory and in your UI reflect and resonate through? The gameplay conveys that. The gameplay allows you to perceive, to have the perception, to have the knowledge of what this physical vibration that's happening is, and to interact with it. That's the most important thing, that there is an interaction present, where you are canvassing the game world that you are, the game that you're in. You're playing your game in order to do this. I spoke about this in all the narrations that I featured in this rerun, and when taken all together, along with the specific Watts passages that make up the whole curriculum stack too, which has a little bit of overlap with the first curriculum, but it's generally full lectures that weren't even excerpted in the first stack. And the way it differs is exactly in this, in the way that the topic is specifically consciousness and sleep and the action of death and the significance of creating and building technology and communicating with ourselves and each other as a social organism. It's that arrival point that kind of feels like a 0 and a 1, two interacting values that go together, so the two curriculums kind of cross back and forth toward each other and away from each other, and they're just bouncing. And each one expresses something similar, but they're kind of the inverted image of each other in what particular concept you're actually thinking about, whether you're thinking about the singularity, the individual, or the totality, the expanse of organism, of the whole, of all experience. About the psychology of creativity. Let's go into this one. I was going to play the complexity problem next.
So let's get started from the top and ask the most obvious question. How do psychologists define creativity?
Well, I think the most fundamental element of creativity is actually conceptualized as a biological trait. So people have different personalities. We all know that, although our terminology for describing those personalities is broad and somewhat difficult to categorize. But psychologists have made a lot of progress on that over the last, particularly in the last 40 years, really from a strictly scientific perspective. And we know that people differ in extroversion, and extroverted people are gregarious and enthusiastic and assertive. And so they seem to wend their way through the world by utilizing social capital and social networks. Extroverts don't necessarily like you, but they like to be around you.
And are creative people extroverts?
No, creative people are slightly tilted towards extroversion, but that's not the fundamental dimension.
Okay.
Introverted people like to spend time alone, and there's plenty of creative introverted people. That another personality dimension is known as neuroticism, somewhat unflatteringly, and it's an index of sensitivity to negative emotion, so that if you know people who are volatile, they're touchy and they tend to fly off the handle, or they're sad or morose or anxious or tend to avoid stressful situations, then they tend to be higher in trait neuroticism. And that's specifically a negative emotion dimension. Extroversion is an index of positive emotion. And so people, they're separate biological systems, positive and negative emotion.
I'm trying to get us back to creativity.
Yep. Well, the third category is agreeableness. Agreeable people are compassionate, and they basically live for close, intimate, personal relationships. There's conscientious people who are dutiful, and then there are open people. And the open people, the dimension is called openness to experience. They're people who are fundamentally interested in ideas. So if you're talking to an open person, they will immediately move the conversation to the discussion of ideas. So most of the people in the audience tonight, for those who aren't here for political curiosity, are here because they're open people. They want to hear an intellectual discussion, and so open people are interested in ideas. That's the intellect component of openness. And then they're also interested in aesthetics, and that would be where the artists really, intellect and aesthetics is where the artists come out. And the thing that's important to know about that, and it's why I went through all 5 traits, is that these are attributes and ways of looking at the world, ways of behaving that are fundamentally rooted in biology. They're very, very deep. It's not a surface trait by any stretch of the imagination. And creative people also tend to be higher in trait intelligence, technically speaking. And that's the ability to manipulate abstractions rapidly.
So is creativity a sort of second level then? Because the traits that you've just described don't include them. Where are they in that group?
Well, creativity loads very highly with openness. Creativity and openness are probably synonymous, more or less. Although it isn't obvious that interest in ideas per se is the same as creativity, but there's very few people who are artistic who aren't very interested in ideas, so they move along the same path very tightly.
So let's unpack this notion, because it's axiomatic that creativity and art are indistinguishable. Is that true from the point of view of a psychologist?
I would say it's a pretty decent truth. It's open people are the ones that are interested in aesthetics. So there are lots of people who are, in some sense, blind to beauty. It's actually one of the things that distinguishes, strangely enough, it distinguishes conservatives and liberals, roughly speaking, because liberal people tend to be high in openness. They tend to be creative, but they're low in trait conscientiousness, so they're not very dutiful. They're not particularly orderly. They're not particularly industrious, not compared to conservatives.
Liberals?
Yes. And it's partly because, you see, this is one of the paradoxes. Conservatives are high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and they're low in openness. And I think the reason for that, in part, is that it's not that easy to be creative if you're too industrious or orderly. Because imagine you want to be a musician and you're 18, 19 years old, or worse, 25 years old, Well, the thing is that it's an insane thing to do if you're someone who's dutiful and career-oriented and practical, because the probability that you're going to monetize your creativity is so low that it's futile to even attempt it in many situations. And so if you're too concerned with convention and productivity, then that's going to undercut your ability to manifest adherence to your creative vision, which also takes you in all sorts of directions, none of which are necessarily practical. So one of the ways of thinking about creativity is that it's a gambling strategy, and conservatives make low risk, low return but certain bets, really, and whereas the more liberal types and the more creative types, they make high risk, high return bets, and so almost all of them fail. But those who succeed dramatically, and they also change the world. And so, although it's very foolish to be creative, it's creative people who lead the vanguard forward into the unknown and transform the world. So, foolish as it is, it's absolutely necessary.
Foolish because risky?
Yes, because risky, yes. I mean, it's foolish in the same way that a high risk, high return bet is foolish. There's a high probability that you'll lose. And so if you're a conservative person, you're very concerned about hedging your bets. You don't want to lose. Being creative is a very bad game to play, but you won't play it anyways because you're conservative, so it isn't going to matter.
So you are an open late teen, and you have conservative parents, and you say, Mom, Dad, I think I've decided that I'm going to be an artist.
Oh yeah, and they think, what's wrong with that kid?
That's a complicated conversation, isn't it?
Yes. It's like discussing color with someone who's colorblind. And I mean that. and it's actually a perverse thing about conservatives in some sense, because the data on the economic utility of artists is really, really strong. I mean, artists and entrepreneurs are the same people, and of course entrepreneurs are the people who provide all of the vision for the entire capitalist system. They're absolutely necessary, but conservatives tend to be so blind to art that they can't even see that the artists are the people who drive the economy forward.
But you make them sound so bad.
No, look, I mean, so here's another way of thinking about it. Is liberals,
are we talking about political conservatives and political liberals?
Yes, we're also talking about personality traits determine voting patterns to a great degree. So people vote their temperaments. And this is something that's really useful to understand when you're engaged in a political discussion, is that the person across the table from you who holds viewpoints other than yours is not doing it because they're stupid or ill-informed. They're doing it because they are not the same sort of person you are. And the funny thing about creative people versus conservative people, say, or liberal people versus conservative people, is that liberals start companies and conservatives run them. So, and I seriously mean that.
I'm glad to know you need conservatives.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah,
a
well,
little bit worried.
they're managers. Like, conscientious people make good managers and good administrators. And they tend to do better in school too, because diligence and dutifulness is an excellent predictor of academic performance. So if you want something that's already been invented, implemented, and then turned into a machine, you don't get someone creative to do that. They're off to do the next thing. They're not even interested in that. You'll bore them to death. So.
Wow. So let's say you're an employer and you need some creative people.
Yeah.
Is there a psychometric test to find out if someone's actually creative and they're going to be useful?
Well, IQ tests work. I mean, not everyone with a high IQ is creative. Lots of lawyers have high IQs and they tend not to be creative at all. Well, you think about why that is, eh? Because lawyers are bound by precedent and rules, and so that isn't the same as being creative. And you want a creative accountant? No, not really. not unless you're looking for a jail sentence. So
they don't like that word at all.
No, yeah, that's right. My creative accountant, wink, wink. Right. So, I mean, I psychometrically tested the 100 most creative lawyers in Canada as a project about 15 years ago with a magazine called L'Expert, which was a high prestige magazine among lawyers. And we had lawyers from across the country be nominated by their firms for creativity. And so we got some really, these were outstanding lawyers. So, and we tested them psychometrically, very, very high in intelligence, but not creative at all. The first trait was conscientious, dutiful, hardworking, diligent, industrious, orderly. Because you're working 70 hours a week, and you better bloody well work if you're in a position like that too. So it's nose to the grindstone stuff. Very low in neuroticism because it's very stressful. So they didn't experience much negative emotion. Very disagreeable people. Well, they're litigators, eh? And so they want to win. They're not compassionate and they're not polite. And only after that were they open. So they weren't creative at all, but they were extraordinarily intelligent. So.
Do employers look for creative people?
No, not generally. Well, it's a real conundrum. So one of the things that's happening right now is that in most businesses, the non-creative people are increasingly being replaced by machines, right? Because anything that's creative can't really be turned into an algorithm that you can run as a machine, but anything that isn't creative can be. And so there's increasing demand in corporations for creative people, but the problem with being creative is that you're useless at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. Because at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, so a power hierarchy, you should do what you're told to do. You're not there to think outside the box. You're there to learn what you're supposed to do and implement it. And creative people are that isn't what they do. Now, what happens, though, to companies is that because they filter all the creative people out at the bottom, and then people start to rise up to the top, you really need creative people at the top because they are the entrepreneurial types, and they're the ones, for example, in law firms, even though lawyers aren't very creative, the more entrepreneurial ones are the ones that bring in all the business. There's great lawyers who can implement, who can write well and communicate well they're not a dime a dozen, but they're relatively common. But the ones who are entrepreneurial, who can go out there and drum up new business, man, those people are hyper valuable, and they're very rare. But it's also very difficult to nurse them within any system because systems do not nurture creativity. They're the antithesis of creativity. Because the artist is always the person who stands outside the structure. And so, or maybe builds his or her own structure, which is also why it's hard to evaluate creative people. You can't. really, because if they're operating within the confines of a system that has an evaluative structure, they're not creative. So they're a real pain to try to manage and to organize. But you can select them. You select people who are high in intelligence and high in openness. We've done that in California. So I work with this company called the Founder Institute. It's quite a cool company. It's run by this guy named Hideo Resi, and he has now started schools to foster entrepreneurship in 135 different cities. And so we're testing in 8 languages, and we can reliably select people who will have a functioning business within a year. You select them for high openness and high intelligence, roughly speaking. So it's certainly something you can do. But then you have to figure out what you're going to do with those people, because telling them what to do isn't going to work, and putting them in a box is completely counterproductive. So they're very annoying, even though they're hyper necessary.
We work with living artists, and I spent my whole career working with living artists. I worked with one dead artist once, and I will never do that again. But it's not for the faint of heart. It's not for everyone to manage creatives.
It's also not for everyone to be one. You know, I've only known one person in my life that attempted to live, I would say, fully as an artist outside of systems. And I mean, he was a jack of all trades. He could do everything. He was a licensed electrician. He was a carpenter. He was a taxi driver. He could pilot boats. He was great at fixing up houses. He was a designer. He was a good speaker. He was a good problem solver. He chased all the rats out of the McGill campus at one point. That was one of his jobs.
Does he speak French?
He does. He does.
Give him my card.
Yeah, well, and he's also a very accomplished artist, but he was the best at that and great at social networking, you know. But even him, he had to be dancing all the time to monetize his capabilities. With that multi-dimensional array of skills. So it's very hard to be an artist and to survive over any reasonable period of time.
What's wrong with our social structure? Well, first of all, are creative people common? Are there a lot of them? Is this a problem we need to solve to find a way to integrate them and to I don't want to say exploit them, but exploit their creativity for the greater good? We don't seem to be very good at that. We've marginalized them. There's no minimum wage for visual artists, for example.
No, we do an abysmal job of it.
Can we fix this, our communities?
Well, the correlation between grades and creativity in university, at the University of Toronto, for example, is 0, right? But that's because it's not that easy to grade people who are creative. But so educational institutions do a great job, especially before the university level, of just crushing creative people. So, because the education system was actually set up back in the late 1900s to train the children of workers to be obedient workers. I mean, you think all the desks are lined up in a row. You're supposed to sit down. You're supposed to shut up. You're supposed to do what you're told. You do things by the bell. That's a factory bell that rings for recess and so forth. They're factories. You don't produce creative people in factories. You produce factory workers, and that's fine, except there aren't any factory workers anymore, so we should probably stop doing it.
I'm not sure things have changed.
They haven't changed at all.
Things haven't changed very much.
No, and it's hard. You were asking about the commonality of creativity too, and the other thing that's difficult and horrible is that creative people are as rare as the winners of races. You know, no matter how many people who are racing, there's only one winner. Yeah, well, and everything tends to go to the winner, and that's how things work in the world. And the thing about being creative is that it isn't that you have to be creative, it's that you have to be more creative than everyone else. And good luck with that, especially in an era where creativity is distributed unbelievably widely on platforms like the internet. Now, I read the other day, and I probably got this figure wrong, but the orders of magnitude are approximately correct. 80 million songs are available for download online. 70 million of them get downloaded 0 times, right? And that's typical of creative production, right? I mean, the number of symphonies that most of you people have written is 0, right? The number of books you've published is 0. The number of books you will publish is 0. If you publish a book, the probability that it will sell more than 100,000 copies is 0, right? The rejection rate for a good scientific paper is 99%. So it's very, very difficult to be creative because you have to get there first. And then even if you do get there, very few people take all of the rewards. You think about Stephen King, for example, right? He's a really good example. It's like half the money in the publishing business goes to Stephen King. And the reason, well, here's why. You know, think about where people buy books, novels. It's in airports often. And so then you imagine that The geographical territory for the distribution of novels is something like the book rack in front of the bookstores in an airport bookstore, right? So it's this rack that's this big. Number 1 position, that's worth God only knows how much. Number 2 position is worth half that. Number 3 position is worth half that. And by the time you get down to number 50 position, well, you're not doing anywhere near as well as number 1, but you're doing way better than all the other people who are getting 0. And that piece of geographic real estate is replicated at every airport all over the world. And so that number 1 slot, man, that's where all the money goes. It's like the 1% of the people who have 50% of the money, and the 1% of them that have 50% of that money, and the 1% of them that have 50% of that money. The winner takes all, and that's particularly true in a creative domain. The winner takes all. And most people stack up at 0. It's really rough.
So creative people are getting a really rough, they're not getting a break at all. And there are probably more creative people doing non-creative work in the workforce than the other way around.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And you know, the thing is, I don't want to paint too dismal a picture about being creative, because one of the things that pays off big for creative people is that they get to be creative, right? There's great aesthetic joy in that, and depth. And I've been privileged because I've worked with more creative people than would fall to the lot, let's say, of the typical psychotherapist, because people often come and see me because they've watched my videos online, and they deal with people who are interested in those subjects tend to be creative. And one of the things I've really been struck by, first of all, I've learned that, for those of you who are interested in such things, that the reason Jungian psychology works is because it works for creative people. It doesn't work at all for non-creative people. It just falls dead and flat for them. They're not interested in it at all. It isn't how they think.
You mean as therapy?
Yeah, it doesn't match their personalities. Whereas creative people, man, they dream archetypal dreams all the time. It's really interesting. And also, they die if they're not being creative. They wither on the vine. I had one client, I really liked him. He was a brilliant architect. And his rational mind was his worst enemy because it just criticized everything. He was hyper-rational, criticized everything, and really in a dark way, and effectively, you know. If I could get him to not think and just create, he was a complete genius. He could. That's where all of the vitality in his life was. You know, that's where the sap rose up inside the dead tree that was sort of embedded inside of him. And it's very common with creative people is that it's their lifeblood, and it really is from a biological perspective. This isn't some epiphenomena. It's built right into people and deeply.
Well, this is something that those of us who work in art museums and work with living artists and contemporary art, and if I have any contemporary curators in the audience, they'll know what I'm talking about. This is a drama that we live on a regular basis. The number 1 is barely affordable, but you're working with people who are absolutely brilliant, but there's no way for them to monetize their brilliance. They're productive, they're making wonderful art. The experts love it, the market's not interested, and they're having a hard time. You can't support them by buying everything they make. You're a public institution. You're building a collection that's going to be useful for the future. So you can't put all your money on the poor ones, but the poor ones are every bit as brilliant as the really, really successful ones from our objective point of view. So this is a problem that I have. And we produce these people in our art schools. We've got very good art schools in Canada. So there's a population of artists who are coming out of our art schools who, as a society, we cannot support. We can only support a very tiny fraction. So, for me, the solution is we need creative people in other professions. Can they be consultants to help other professions be successful?
Well, if if you're a business and you're facing problems that you don't know how to solve, it's creative people that you want to consult with, because they will think laterally. I mean, you asked about the psychometric definition of creativity earlier. I mean, imagine that people, it's a very complicated concept to get across properly, but if you think about musical genres, you can imagine that there are people who work very well within a tight musical genre. Okay, they're creative, but only creative within the confines of that genre. But there are multiple genres. If you're super creative, you would be able to be creative across multiple genres, right? And so, what that means is that you can always step outside the box you're in and think outside of it. And that's what creative people do. And so if you're trapped in your box, your company is going down the drain, for example, because your product is no longer useful. You need someone who can come in and think laterally, which is what entrepreneurs do. I mean, one of the hallmarks of an entrepreneurial thinker, it's sort of entered the jargon of the venture capitalist sphere, for example, is that an entrepreneur has to be able to pivot So let's say you have you're an entrepreneur, you want to bring an idea to market. And you have your idea, it's well developed. You go out in the market and you find there's no market for that idea, which is what's going to happen to all your creative ideas, by the way, because matching them with the market, well, matching them with the market is exceptionally difficult because you have to be there at the right time and in the right place. You have to be brilliant, you have to come up with a product, that's not easy, then people have to want it, and they have to want it now. And often that means if you're first to market, you're dead because you can't even advertise your damn product because there's no lexicon for it. How do you sell something to people that they don't even know exists? So that's the first person in a brand new field dies for sure. You need 10 people out there advertising it before anybody can be successful. But the entrepreneurs, in their early stage, they have to pivot. And what that means is that if their first idea doesn't work because it doesn't fit the market, for example, they have to be able to generate another one on the fly. And creative people, that's what they do. You know, they're problem solvers. And if you want creative problem solvers, then you hire creative people. Now, if you hired artists, you would get creative people insofar as the art schools are able to select creative people. And there's self-selection, so they select creative people and posers. You know,
well, let's talk about the posers. How can an art collector, let's say, who doesn't trust dealers and really is only interested in their own eye, and they go around and they're looking at all the various galleries and they're building their own collection, which is unusual, by the way, because they do rely a lot on the dealers. They never ask my opinion, but anyway, how do you know the difference between a poser, someone who's just merely clever, and someone who's authentically creative and is original and is moving the story forward, if you don't have very much experience in the game? By the way, I'm an expert in that.
It's easy. You just wait 200 years. You just wait until 200 years after they're dead. Yeah. Yes. And then skim off the top. Yeah.
We actually think of ourselves, those who work in art museums and spending public money on exhibitions and collections, we talk amongst ourselves and we're very careful about winnowing through the people who are also rands, posers, or who are not actually going to be the ones who are going to make that flag that will remind everyone of 2017 versus the ones who are.
Well, when you're trying to do...
What's the real art history of Canada? Is it with these artists or that one?
When you're trying to do that, I mean, okay, so first of all, we'll assume that you're a creative person, and I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. And then we'll also assume that you're very well educated in the history of art. So you're in a good position because you can tell when something's been done before.
Right.
And you also know the difference between something that's been done well and something that hasn't. So in order to do the selection process properly, then you'd have to be creative. You have to have the intelligence and the temperament for it, and that's the capability of perceiving it.
So you're saying I'm creative?
Well, it's highly probable, because otherwise the probability that you'd be in this position and interested in it, you actually like art.
I do.
Well, there you go. So I mean, if you don't like art, you're probably not creative. And if you genuinely like it, and then it isn't even liking, it's like you can't live without it. And that's a whole different thing. And it's very difficult for people who aren't like that to understand it. You know, but if you are like that, then art speaks to you, and it speaks this language of tremendous beauty and continual revelation. And you can educate yourself, obviously. You do that by, I would say, mostly studying philosophy, literature, all the artistic domains, the humanities. Make yourself a connoisseur and ally that with your temperament, and then you have a reasonable chance at selecting things that at least aren't duplicates of what's been happening before.
Right. What I normally tell people is get your own information and work hard. Study hard if this is going to be a serious hobby of yours and you're going to be investing a lot of money in it. Get your own information.
Right. Well, and people are people are absolutely terrified of art. They're absolutely terrified of it. I know. Which is why Canadians' favorite decorating color is beige. It's like, really? It's like, don't paint your wall red because you'll never be able to resell your house. It's like everybody accepts that as a truth. It's like, you know, people can paint walls. It's a rather foolish piece, but people are terrified that they'll make an aesthetically displeasing choice and that everyone will laugh at them, and so they stick with beige. And they really are frightened of art, and no wonder they should be. So
now, why should they be frightened of art?
Because it speaks of the ultimate depths. If it's real art, it brings it into your house, man. You know, people come. I've got like 600 paintings in my house. Every square inch of the house is covered with paintings, and you know, it's quite a shock for people when they come in. Well, it's because some of them are of Lenin, so surprisingly enough. Yeah,
I've been in your house, Jordan, and a lot of them are of Lenin.
Yes, yes. Well, I collected a bunch of Soviet realist art because I have interest in totalitarianism. So, but I have, anyways, my walls are completely covered with art.
And not as a nostalgia. It's not a
No,
nostalgia.
it's not a nostalgia thing. No. It might be a prophetic thing, though.
Oh dear. Well, let's not go down that road. I want to talk about being a parent. And you don't know whether you have a creative child or not. What is the wrong way to be a parent if you have a creative child and you don't know it? And what's the right way? I mean, you're a parent.
Well, here's a good thing to do if you want to have a creative genius as an adult child. Die before they're 10. That helps a lot. So there's quite an extensive list. So if you're inclined to do that, suicide would really do it because.
Now explain. Explain that, please.
Yeah, well, there's a famous psychologist named Hans Eysenck who was the most highly cited psychologist in the world for a long time, and for all I know, still may be. He wrote a great book called Genius, which is a real study of creativity. It's the real thing, and so people just hate it because it's not full of, platitudes that will make you feel good. He says to be truly creative, you have to have a near genius level IQ, and that sort of puts you in the 1 in 1,000 range. So that's kind of annoying to begin with. That might be me.
I don't know.
and so, but he's also found that early traumatic experiences are good predictors of late creativity. Now we should also say that early traumatic experiences are also great predictors of catastrophic adult lives. So, but you can imagine the thing that people don't understand about creativity, or one of them, is that there's no reason to be creative unless you have a problem to solve. And if someone dies on you young and you're forced to fend your way in the world and to deal with that kind of trauma, you have to put yourself together in a creative manner, and it's no joke. And so early negative experiences allied with high intelligence and this kind of temperament that we were talking about is one of the things that fosters creative production. And parents are misinformed about this sort of thing because they think that if they just do laissez-faire things with their children, you can do anything you want, they'll automatically be creative. It's like that's the stupidest thing you could possibly imagine, because that isn't how creativity works. Creativity emerges when you put serious constraints on things. And so a good example of that, like a symbolic example, is the example of the genie. And the word genie is at the root of the word genius, so they're nicely tied together. And a genie is this tremendous godlike force encapsulated in this tiny little space. And in order for the genie to be able to grant wishes, it has to be both constrained extraordinarily tightly and be without constraint at the same time. It's the conjunction of those two things. And so in order to have someone be creative, you have to set them a difficult problem. Great literary figures, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, people like that, Shakespeare, man, they're solving tough problems. And someone like Picasso, he invented an entirely new way to see. It's like, try that.
Well,
That's what visual artists are
Brock
doing.
did, but he worked very closely with Brock.
Well,
anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to be a nerd here, but
fair enough.
So let's go back to this trauma thing. What if you are, your personality traits point to conservative 10-year-old and your parent dies? What happens to you? Do you automatically become creative, or are you out of luck?
You just spiral into the abyss and there's no... No, I would say that what a conservative child would do.
Does that make you creative?
No,
or
it's
either you are or you're not?
It's very unlikely. I mean, a lot of these things are more biologically determined than people like to admit. And so, I mean, what? If you're introverted, try turning yourself into an extrovert. See how well that works. It's good luck. Like if you have a really introverted child, you can make that child socially skilled and able to tolerate interactions with groups, but the probability that you'll make that child like it is so low. Because introverts, for example, get exhausted by social contact. So those of you in the audience, you think, well, you go to a party, do you have more energy afterwards or less? If the answer is, well, far less, I need to go sit in a dark room with an ice pack on my head, then, then you're more introverted. And it's very difficult to move that. You can, but it's very hard. And creativity is the same way. You can crush it. You can crush it.
Crush creativity.
Oh, sure, that's easy. And we do that all the time. And you're usually pretty happy about it, too. So,
Well, give us an example of how to crush creativity so we don't do it.
Quit daydreaming.
Oh, my God. Yes, I remember
that's
one.
the same thing as saying quit being creative. That's the same thing. Quit daydreaming. It's like, yeah, quit using your imagination. That'll really
You're bringing
work.
back bad memories now, Jordan.
Yeah, well, schools do that all the time. Stop daydreaming and you know, pay attention to your work. It's like, well, what if my work is daydreaming? Well, then we're going to punish you because you're going to be a good worker in a factory. Oh, yeah, those disappeared 100 years ago. I guess we haven't noticed yet. Oh, well, too bad for us. And our children. Right, and our future for that matter, because it's unbelievably boneheaded. But you know, once a system gets established, it tends to persist, and so, well, that's how it is. But it's pretty sad.
So where are the creative people in our society? We know that they're artists. So
they're starving in garrets.
Yeah, well, or are they working at McDonald's?
No, like how about Bill Gates? He did all right. Steve Jobs, he did all right.
No, but I mean, what are the professions
they're at the pinnacle
where people get to be creative in their jobs? Because we've got this professional deformation that makes us think that only artists are creative and everybody else is just watching.
Well, entrepreneurs for sure. So people who start companies, they're the same people. They're the same people as artists, and you know, they're more gadget oriented usually, but the temperamental predictors are exactly the same. And so I would say you find artists. Creative people overrepresented among people who you might regard as failures over their life course, and radically overrepresented among people that you would regard as spectacularly successful. And that's the high risk, high return gambling strategy, essentially. So
we've eliminated lawyers and accountants.
Bankers, you can throw them out too.
Bankers are gone.
Any managerial and administrative position is generally very low creative.
Wow.
Writers, artists, movie makers, literary people. I wouldn't say professors. We did a study a while back predicting what graduate student attributes predicted scientific success. Creativity was negatively correlated. Well, it's because, again, science is actually an algorithmic machine, right? That's why it's so powerful, is that you can get people who aren't creative but who will work hard, and they crank the levers, and out comes knowledge. And it's an extraordinarily powerful technology. But you can't get creative things published. You can get incrementally better things published. Creative things, it's like no one has any idea what to do with them. And the non-creative people will think, no, that's rubbish. It's like they don't know any better, but it's very, very hard to evaluate.
Are you creative?
See my socks?
Yeah, no. That wasn't you, that was Van Gogh.
Yeah, but I picked them out. Actually, my wife picked them out. But I'll wear them. Yes, I'm creative.
I wanted to ask you, and I think we have a bit of time left, I wanted to get in a little bit deeper. Some of the controversies that we have lived through in the past here at the National Gallery, let's talk about Voice of Fire, for example. And one of the arguments was, well, there's no skill involved. Where's the creativity? And that's, from my point of view, it's very easy to answer. Following what you've just said, Barnett Newman, who was a lousy painter, wasn't even interested in painting, was actually one of the most important artists of the 20th century, gave himself these constraints. He really, really restricted his field of operation to vertical stripes, and with a sort of metaphorical connection to humanity and our vertical aspirations. Can we talk about creativity when we're getting into an area of extreme constraint on the part of an artist, a minimalist who paints, let's just say, someone like, there's a very famous Polish artist whose name escapes me right now, but somebody's going to yell that out, who counted for his entire life and then took a picture of himself every 10 years. And just counted until the color ran out, and then he starts over with another color. And his name is not coming to me.
Okay.
But so, if you're looking at this objectively, conceptually, it's really quite powerful and unique. And these paintings, there's one at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and we will always regret not having one here at the National Gallery. We're not likely to have one. He died. And they're quite sought after. Can you still talk about creativity when someone has a great idea in 1964 and then just proceeds to produce that idea and replicate the same thing for the rest of their lives? I'm getting into the deep psychoanalysis of creativity.
Okay, well, there's a couple of things I would say about that. The first is that people were upset about that painting because they think that art is decoration. They thought, well, you know, that's not decoration, or they think that I'd be able to do that, which they wouldn't, by the way, because it's a lot harder than it sounds or than it looks. But art is not decoration. That's absolutely foolish. Art is exploration. And artists train people to see. Like, you know, when most of you would, I presume, would regard Impressionist art as both self-evidently beautiful and also as relatively traditional, because of course you all now see like Impressionists see, all of you that are even vaguely part of the 20th century. You can't help it because the Impressionist aesthetic saturated everything, saturated advertisements, saturated movies, saturated everything. You now see like an Impressionist. They taught you to see, but back when the Impressionists first showed up, there were riots when their art was hung because the idea of perceiving that way was so radical that it caused people to have emotional fits. You know, and so artists teach people to see, and I mean that literally. It's very hard to perceive the world. And so, and who was the artist that made all the squares with red and yellow and white?
Oh, Pete Mondrian.
Mondrian, he's a great example. I mean, if you go downtown Toronto now, there are Mondrian buildings everywhere. You know, and so he was playing very, very carefully and intensely with these arrays of geometric shapes, you know, and that's not well, I like it, but it's not particularly decorative, and it's certainly not naturalistic or realistic. It's like, what's this crazy guy up to with all his squares? It's like, well, everything is built out of squares. So he's thinking, well, what are the interesting things we can do with squares so they look, they shimmer and glow, and so that we get the geometric harmony proper, and it's just invaded architecture. You can see Mondrian absolutely everywhere. And so these people, so here's a way of thinking about artistic and creative people from a biological perspective. So imagine that the world is basically an explored territory inside an unexplored territory. Every world is like that. Everywhere you go is like that. There's things you know and there's things you don't know. And the conservative people like to be in the middle of the things that are known. And they can master that space, and they're good at maintaining it. But the artists like to be right out on the edge, and that's the edge between chaos and order. And they like to expand the domain of order out into the chaos. And they do that first by transforming perception. And you can see very concrete examples of this if you think about what creative people do in cities. They always do it, the same thing. So they're starving to death, and this is partly why, but they go in a city and they look at some ratty area that's sort of quasi-criminal and that's seen better days, and they go there and they think, you know, with a little work, this could be cool. And so then they rush in there and they build some galleries and show some art, and they civilize it a bit, and then a coffee shop pops up, and you know, the next thing you know, the yuppies move in because they're sort of creative but also kind of conservative, so they're the next ones into the frontier, and then the developers show up and they kick all the artists out. But that's okay, because then the artists go off and rejuvenate some other area, and that's what artists do, is that they're transforming chaos into order all the time. That's where they live on that edge. And so it's a very tough place to live because you can fall into the chaos at any time.
This is kind of blowing my mind, actually, because I just wrote recently in the commemorative book for the 150th here at the gallery that science helps us understand the world, whereas artists create a world that we can understand. It's just they're sort of it amounts to the same, but they're opposite approaches.
Well,
and you just said that.
Artists have always been on the frontier of human understanding. You know, the artist bears the same relationship to society that the dream bears to mental life. Like when you're dreaming at night, you're actually pretty creative when you're dreaming, and that's why when you remember a dream, you think, oh man, like where did that come from? Which is pretty weird, that something can happen in your head and you have no idea how it got there or what it means. That's a bloody miracle. You know, every night that happens. It's like, I had a dream. Where did it come from? What does it mean that you had it? How can you not understand it? How can you produce something like that? It's like a whole movie that you don't even understand. You produce it. You don't produce it. You experience it. The dream is the thing that mediates between order and chaos. It starts to make chaos into order. So it's half chaos. That's why it's not comprehensible. And artists play exactly the same role in society. They're the visionaries that start to transform what we don't understand into at least what we can start to see. And they've always been that. They've always been at the vanguard. That's their biological niche.
So they're creating confidence for the community.
They're the civilizing agents. I mean, look at Europe. Think about, and this is one of the things that really bothers me about bothers me about the fact that conservative people have a hard time properly valuing art economically. It's so paradoxical because conservatives are very concerned about economics. It's like, okay, fine, then why don't you fund the damn artists? Because you look, Europe is so beautiful that it's just heartbreaking when you go there. I mean, I've been to like medieval villages in Germany, for example. It just made me cry when I saw them. They're so damn beautiful. And the beauty that the Europeans have produced is infinitely valuable. People go from all over the world on pilgrimages to Europe just to look at beautiful things. It nourishes their soul. They're priceless. Paris is priceless. Rome is priceless. And it's all beauty that drives it. It's phenomenally valuable. And Canada is just ugly as sin, man. Really.
Okay.
Really, we should be ashamed of ourselves.
You are not going to get an argument from me on that subject.
Yeah.
What's wrong with us? I come from my family. There were some creative people. My father was an actor. My mother was not. She was very utilitarian. Why are we as a society so utilitarian? Because we really are. Are we still in survival mode because it's so cold? I don't understand that, because we actually produce probably more brilliant artists per capita than a lot of other countries in the world. I would say most, in fact. What's wrong with our cities?
It's a really, really complicated question. I mean, I've really asked myself that in Toronto, because I mean, I like Toronto, but like art from an aesthetic perspective, it's like, not good. Not good at all. It's getting better. I mean, there's some creative buildings coming up in Toronto, and so some of it is, I think, a function of population size. You know, you need a pretty wicked population center before you start getting a lot of creative occurrences happening. But there's an intrinsic middle of the roadness that characterizes Canadian society that makes it nice, I suppose, which is a very low end virtue in my estimation. It's like, what's my moral virtue? I'm fundamentally harmless. Jesus, you think you could do better than that? So I had an experience with that at the University of Toronto that I'll tell you about, because I think it's extraordinarily comical, and then I'll tell you a little story about how I figured it out. I spent a bunch of time with this artist I told you about, trying to transform my cinder block hellhole, fluorescent lit factory catastrophe of an office into something that someone with some sense could sit in for 30 years without dying. And so I got this artist to act as a consultant.
Does your employer know your feelings about this?
Yes, definitely, yes. They know my feelings about a lot of things, actually. So I brought this artist in, and I loved consulting with him, because he liked to do really spectacular things for no money, which is a lovely set of constraints.
Very creative.
We were going to cover the cinder block walls with cherry plywood, good one side, and then buff it and varnish it, so I'd have a wood paneled office. And then he was going to paint the drop ceilings. Jesus, hell is a place of drop ceilings and fluorescent lights. And so he was going to paint them with this paint called hammerite that looks like beaten steel when it dries.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we had these really cool ideas, and I had a budget of like $1,200, so we were going to completely transform the office for $1,200. And I talked to the former chair of the psychology department about this, who I had some discussions with about transforming the psychology department from this, like, my creative brother-in-law, who designed the chip in the iPhone, by the way, he called the architecture hosable. And what he meant by was that anything of any sort could happen in that building, and you could just hose it down and it would be okay. It's like, God. So my former chair was sort of sensitive to this sort of thing, so we had a bit of a talk about maybe doing some transformations, and I thought that this person was on board. But then when I asked, I was sharing this excitedly, and this person said, well, you can't do that. And I shook my head, and I thought, okay, I'm going to make something ugly, better, fast, with no trouble, for no money. And your response is, you can't do that. And I thought, okay, well, I said, well, why not? And the person said, because everyone would want it. And I thought two things. A, we're in kindergarten, and And B, oh, I'm talking to someone insane. So, so then I changed my conversational tack quite substantially. And I had to default to plan B, which made my office very colorful. It's got like drop kind of copper ceiling, and it's full of paintings, and people come in and they're, you know, it's a place of beauty and creativity, and not a bloody, horrible, fluorescent lit factory. Mm-hmm. And I had to fight for that a lot. It was weird. And then I found out afterwards that for a while the university, the department would bring new potential hires into my office to show them the office, to show them what was possible at the University of Toronto. So I thought that was so comical. But anyways, I do have a point of this story, because I thought about that for a long time. I thought, oh God, people are afraid of what I'm doing in this office. Well, and for good reason, I guess. But I thought there's something to this that I don't understand. There's really something to this. So then I came across this story by Robert Sapolsky. I think it was Robert Sapolsky. And he was talking about zebras. And so I'll take 2 minutes and tell you the zebra story, because if you understand this story, you understand absolutely everything about human beings. And so it's worth 2 minutes. So you know, zebras hypothetically are camouflaged, right? That's what everyone says. But come on, really? Lions are camouflaged. They're the same color as the grass. Zebras are black and white. You can see one of those things like a mile away. But there isn't a zebra. There's a herd of zebras. And so the zebra is actually camouflaged against the herd. Now that's something to think about. So the stripes of zebras are the zebra's jargon. That's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. So anyways, so biologists go out and study zebras, and zebra biologists, and they got to watch a zebra to figure out what it's up to. So they watch a zebra, and then they make a note, and then they look up and they think, oh my God, like which collection of black and white stripes was that zebra? Because the stripes don't outline the zebra, and they camouflage the zebra perfectly against the herd. So if you look away from the zebra down and back up, you don't know what you're looking at. So the biologists think, oh crap, we better solve this problem. So they drive up to the herd with a Jeep and a bucket of red paint and a stick with a rag on the end of it, and they paint one of the zebra's haunches with a red spot, or they clip its ear like you do with cattle. Then you can keep track of the zebra. Guess what happens to the zebra? The lions eat it.
Oh.
Right. Oh is right. Bloody right. Oh, yeah. The lions cannot hunt a single zebra down unless they can identify it, because they organize their hunt. They have to organize their hunt around and identify.
You can't hunt 4 zebras. You can only hunt one at a time.
You can't hunt a blur of zebras.
No.
And so the reason they go after the little ones, or the ones that limp, isn't because, you know, they're part of kind nature and just culling the weak. That they like a nice, healthy, delicious, juicy zebra as much as the next person, you know. But they have to be able to identify. So the thing is you make yourself colorful. You stand out. The lions will kill you.
Aha.
Right. Well, Canadians, we don't like to stand out. We like everybody to do okay. But we don't like it very much when people stand out. And so, I mean, I'm not being entirely critical of that. I really do understand it. I really do understand it.
Because there's lions out there, you guys.
There are. That's right. There definitely are. And if you stick your neck out, then the lions will come. Or the sword, because that's a common saying, right? Mm-hmm. The head that sticks up above the rest is the first to be cut off by the sword. Mm-hmm. Many cultures have a saying like that. The poppy that grows higher than the rest is the first.
The tall poppy syndrome.
Exactly. And so, and it's exactly right. It's biologically correct. Now, why Canadians are particularly prone to that, I don't know if we are particularly prone to it, but we certainly have hideous cities, and we should be embarrassed about it, because we have the wealth to make them beautiful, and the return on that investment would be absolutely unparalleled. So, and it's something that, if people understood the relationship properly between creativity and economics, then we wouldn't have to have an ideological discussion about creativity, right? Because
we'd have a practical one.
We'd have a practical one. It's like, well, I don't think much of artists, says the lawyer, but they generate a lot of income, and I'm pretty happy about money. It's like, okay, maybe we can have a discussion. And
so I find it very interesting right now, the institutional failure that we're witnessing at a very, very high up, if you will, federal level of the social order that I'm subject to here. And the fundamental reason we're witnessing this institutional failure is something I explained in the narration about the abandoned money that I included in the Mega Rerun. There's too many rulers, bosses, trying to govern by ruling. They won't give it up. They don't want to abandon it. Not at all. They don't even want to slightly abandon it. They don't even want to try anything more than like a 3-month abandonment of it, which was paid out to only specific people who qualified for an unemployment insurance type of payment process in going out of employment during the public health emergency that we're in. Instead of applying what was learned from that temporary abandonment of the bossing paradigm and rolling it out as a functional replacement for the concept of an unemployment insurance, they just let it run out and did not renew it and did not implement it as the working universal policy. And so now we're at the corresponding point of the scaffolding program underneath that, which just basically extended the use of the unemployment insurance for like an extra 25 weeks or something. It was some extension of its normal limit because they figured we weren't going to completely recover out of the public health emergency in that amount of time. I think most of us at my level predicted that not only would we not be through it in the extended amount of time, but it would be much worse. It is. Those who are obsessed and hung up on the bossing are in refusal of that. They're in denial. They won't look at reality of the fact that the problem is much, much worse now, and particularly compounding in the fact that there are costs and there are escalating harms on people who are impacted by this, people who have lost part of their social mesh, even lost people very vital, very essential in their family functioning. But none of the work that has been lost and impacted has either been able to come back nor been replaced by some other elusive type of work or employment. So the very idea of unemployment insurance as an institution is just one example of the institutional failures that we have seen unfold here. It's just one. But the greater institutional failure is in the bosses and the rulers who just will not let go of ruling. They're not allowing what would be a sane response to the escalating nature of the emergency and the economic impact thereof. And while countless other countries and states have demonstrated what would have been a sane response and one leading to actual recovery and actual prevailing over the public health emergency situation, we have witnessed the opposite. We have witnessed a total unraveling, and we're nearing the complete collapse point in this. And so we're seeing it, as I mentioned in earlier commentaries, what we're seeing now is the rising up of impact to the level where we're seeing virtually every single news anchor and person who speaks on this topic, those that we're used to tuning into for their opinions and for their talk, are entering, it's this very surreal space to see all of the popular voices basically saying the same thing, that our leaders are insane, they're not leading, and they're not even beginning to assess the actions that would constitute not being in a total institutional failure as a state, as a so-called civilized or first world society. It's just not happening. And the reason is that that unemployment insurance extension is done. And absolutely no replacement or update institution that would not be failed they're absolutely refusing to breach into the politics of direct cash, which is necessary at this point. It's not just an option, it's the only possible way for the amount of employment infrastructure. Employment, of course, as a centralized income type of a failed institution, such as it is, the sheer amount of failure there of people who had previously been receiving that centralized wage, but can no longer receive it now that the entire crisis has unfolded. That's not coming back ever. They will never ever have work of this type from the centralized wage providers ever again. And the only option here is to abandon the idea of ruling them through employment and through a centralized wage, and do what the sane countries of this planet have done with direct cash as the replacement for these failed institutions, as the new institution which will see a society through such a dangerous crisis. The crisis is simply revealing the institutional failure that was already there. We were already suffering under the impacts of this institutional failure before the emergency, and it was already its own type of emergency before being flipped upside down and shaken, and all the loose parts just absolutely flying off of it, to the point at this moment it's equal parts absurdly amusing and horrifying to see it in such the state as it's been flipped upside down and just literally centrifugally spun until the whole thing's ready to just completely implode at this point, because what we need is the abandonment of bossing. We need a society to function under the realization that placing pressure, the pressure of taxing rent and presuming to extract monetary participation from every single person in the social order, can't work. And the reason why it can't work is there's no actual work, there's no actual sensation or value being contributed by those who are trying to extract the fee, the rent, the tax. They're not doing anything. There's no transaction taking place. It's literally just financial criminal behavior taking place when you go to your landlord and say, here's $1,500 so that I won't be forcibly pushed out of this structure I'm trying to occupy at the moment to educate my children. No. That's financial criminal behavior. And it's the primary institutional failure underneath the ruler obsession that we've got going on, all the way up through to the very top of the branches of so-called government here. It's underlied, it's underpinned by fraud, by institutional fraud against the well-being of your basic citizen, who is placed with a heavy, heavy burden of purchase, of a purchase that actually amounts to a non-transaction. That there's nothing changing hands at all. So what you end up with, the result here, when you isolate all the elements of the equation, you factor it, cancel out the things that are the same on both sides, you end up with the exact same math result as broken monarchies and in the slavery situation. You have exactly that result, just strung out into the situation where the serf is owned by the whole collective of the so-called wealthy. The problem with I have with the term wealthy is that it's a failure to use the word correctly. Wealth, in order to be called wealth, has to correspond to a sensation, to something real in reality, as Watts explains and helps us understand. So we don't really we have the least amount of wealth that we've ever seen, perhaps, because we have the worst abandoners of wealth, of the sensation of goodness and of well-being that society, that history has ever seen. We have to stop abandoning it. We have to start actualizing the gains from technology into reality sensation, reality well-being for the cells that make up the entire social organism. And it's very easy to do. Our technology of money can do it. Once those trying to govern by ruling stop placing the burden of a completely hollow, completely corrupt purchase on top of every citizen, and understand that can't work, because that's just draining all of society of its possible human capital, because it's taking that burden of credit repayment out of every single person at the beginning of every single month. It can't work. It's taking so much away. I can really only convey this through how Jordan Peterson describes it as the complexity problem. It's the pinnacle of complexity problem.
Okay, so let's go back to the complexity problem. See, I actually think it's in some sense, it's the fundamental problem. When you read about the terror management theorist types, they think that death is the fundamental problem. And that's a good argument, because it's definitely a fundamental problem, but I think it's a subset of the complexity problem. And the reason I think that is because sometimes people's lives become so complex that they'd rather be dead. So, and the reason they seek death through suicide is to make the complexity go away, because complexity causes suffering if it's uncontrolled. You know, things just get beyond your control. And that can happen, you know, if you're hit by 3 or 4 catastrophes at the same time. You know, maybe you have, the political system collapses, there's hyperinflation, you lose your job, and you have someone that you love or 2 people die, and maybe you get cancer, something like that. Like that, those things happen to people, and they just think, well, there's no getting out of this. Like, it's just too much. And you know, one of the things that's very interesting about being a psychologist is that what you learn if you're going to be a psychologist is that people come to you with mental illnesses, and that's almost never true. People come to you because their lives are so damn complicated they cannot stay on top of them in any way that doesn't make it look like they're just going to get more complicated. And so then that causes symptoms. You know, it's like, there's this old idea, it's sort of a metaphor for genetic susceptibility. Take a balloon and blow it up until it's beyond its tolerance, it's going to blow out at the weakest point. Well, that's sort of what a genetic susceptibility is. If I just keep adding complexity on top of you, at some point you'll blow out at your weakest point. You know, maybe you'll get physiologically ill, maybe you'll start drinking, maybe you'll develop an anxiety disorder, maybe you'll get OCD, maybe you'll get depressed, whatever. There'll be something about you that's the weakest point, and if I just push, that's where you'll blow out. So that's a mental illness, but those things almost never just happen. Sometimes, but not very often. Usually people have just been hammered like 2 or 3 different ways, and then they collapse in the direction of their biological weakness, and then maybe you put them back together, but it's almost always a complexity related phenomena rather than a mental illness related phenomena. Not always, but almost always. One of the things that you view, for example, when you're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, is that it's almost always the case that someone who suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, which you might think of as a real life reincarnation of the fall, is that people encounter something malevolent and it breaks them, because it's the worst thing to understand. It's like suffering is one thing, man, that's bad enough. Vulnerability and suffering, that's bad enough. But to encounter someone who wishes that upon you and will work to bring it about, that's a whole different category of horrible, especially when it also reflects something back to you about yourself. Because if someone else can do that to you and they're human, that means that you partake of the same essence. Strangely enough, that's actually the cure to some degree to post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that, like, if you've been victimized, you're naive and you've been victimized, the way out of that is to no longer be naive and to no longer be victimized. And that means that you see this reflected in the Harry Potter idea, for example, that the reason that Harry Potter can withstand Voldemort is because he's got a piece of him, right? He's been touched by it. And the way that you keep the psychopaths at bay is to develop the inner psychopath so that you know one when you see one, right? And then, but that's a voluntary thing. It's like a set of tools that you have at your disposal, which is full knowledge of evil. And that does, Nietzsche said, if you look into an abyss for too long, you risk having the abyss gaze back into you, right? The idea is that if you look at something monstrous, you have a tendency to turn into a monster. And people are often very afraid of looking at monstrous things exactly for that reason. And then the question is, well, should you turn into a monster? And the answer to that is yes, you should. But you should do it voluntarily and not accidentally. And you should do it with the good in mind rather than falling prey to it by possession, essentially, because that's the alternative. Now, how does it possess you? That's easy. Your suffering makes you bitter. Your bitterness makes you resentful. Your resentment makes you vengeful. And once you're on that road, you go down that a little bit farther, man. Well, you end up fantasizing in your basement about shooting up the local high school and then killing yourself, right? Because that's sort of the ultimate end of that line of pathological reasoning. Being should be eradicated because of its intrinsic evil, and I'm exactly the person to do it, and I'll cap it off with an indication of my own lack of worth just to hammer the point home, right? And if I can garner a little posthumous fame along the way, well, that'll satisfy my primordial primate dominance hierarchy imaginings too, at least in fantasy. So, you know, it's the full package if you want to go down that route. And of course, people don't like to think about that sort of thing, and it's no bloody wonder. But without the capability for mayhem, you're a potential victim to mayhem. So you need your sword. It should be sheathed, but you need to have it. And it's very frequently the case. If you treat someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's two things you have to do. You have to help them develop a very articulated philosophy of evil, because otherwise their brain bothers them over and over and over. Why were you so naive? How did you become victimized? Why were you such a sucker? These are good questions. You don't want to have that happen to you again. You don't want to be exploited twice. Okay, so your eyes have to open up. We know the price of that from the Egyptian myth, right? You come into contact with Seth. What happens? Even if you're a god, you lose an eye. It's no joke, man. It's no joke. And then the cure for that is the movement down into the underworld and the revitalization of the Father. That's the identification with the force that created culture, right? And that then there's you and that together. Then you can withstand malevolence. Maybe you can withstand tragedy and malevolence. And then that's the whole secret, right? Because that's what you want in life. You need to be able to withstand tragedy, and you need to be able to withstand malevolence, because those are the forces that are always working against you. And so this is associated with the Jungian idea of incorporation of the shadow, right? You have to be, we know this, God, we know how predators work with regards to children even. If you're a pedophilic predator and you're looking at a landscape of children, the child that you're going to go after is the one that's timid and won't fight back. You pick your victim. And predatory people in general are exactly like that, man. Because they're predators. They're not going to attack someone who's going to fight back. In fact, the issue is likely not to even come up. They're going to be looking for someone, one way or another, that cannot conceptualize what they are. And then, perfect. It's an open season, man. It's open season. And so if you're treating someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, first, they need an introduction to the philosophy of malevolence, and second, they have to learn to become dangerous, because that's the only way out. What's the alternative? They get these recurrent thoughts about their vulnerability in the face of malevolence and their own naivety, because by definition, if someone psychopathic has exploited you, you're too naive. It's a definitional issue. You can say, well, that's no fault of mine. How the hell could I be prepared? Fair enough, man. Perfectly reasonable objection. Doesn't solve your problem, because it's an eternal problem, right? The eternal problem is, how do you deal with tragedy and malevolence? And you can say, well, I'm not prepared. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Unsurprising, especially if you were overprotected as a child. It's not a good idea to overprotect your kids, because the snakes are going to come into the garden no matter what you do. And so then you, instead of trying to keep the damn snakes away, what you do is you arm your child with something that can help them chop them into pieces and make the world out of them. So that the trick for human thriving in the face of suffering and malevolence is strength, not protection. It's a completely different idea. We also know this clinically. We know, for example, that if you treat people with exposure therapy for agoraphobia, which is, roughly speaking, the fear of chaos, I would say, the fear of everything, you don't make them less afraid. You make them braver. It's not the same thing. Because with an agoraphobic, see, what happens to them is the fall. They never conceptualize death and suffering. They're naive, right? It never enters the theater of their imagination, and it's because they're protected from it. But then something happens. This often happens to women in their 40s, because they're the people most likely to develop agoraphobia. Something happens. They've been protected from chaos by authority their entire life. So maybe they had an overprotective father, and then they went to an overprotective boyfriend, and then they went to an overprotective husband. And maybe they were willing to be subjugated to all three of those because of the protection, right? So that's the bargain. They stay weak and dependent, and maybe they have to because that's the only way they can appeal to the person who's hyperprotective. But the price they pay for that is that they're not sufficiently competent. And then something happens in their life, often in their 40s, they develop heart palpitations, maybe as a consequence of menopause. Their heart starts to beat erratically, and they think, oh no, death. It's like, well, who are you going to talk to about that, right? There's no protection from authority for that. Or maybe their friend gets divorced, or maybe their sister dies, or something like that. It brings up the specter of mortality, and maybe the specter of malevolence and mortality, and it brings it up in a way that authority, recourse to authority, cannot solve. And so then they have panic attacks. What happens? They go out, they get afraid, they feel their heart beating, then they get afraid of their heart beating because they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and I'm going to make a fool of myself while I'm doing it and attract a lot of attention. So the two big fears come up: mortality and social judgment. And then they have a panic attack. It's like fight or flight's gone out of control. Very, very unpleasant. Then they start to avoid the places they've had a panic attack. Then they end up not being able to go anywhere. So then Tiamat has come back, right? A huge monster, a little victim. And so what do you do with them? Well, there's no saying, no, there's no Tiamat. That's done, right? Their naivety is over. They've had a direct contact with the threat of mortality and social judgment. They've met the terrible mother, and they've met the terrible father. And there's no going back. There's no saying, oh, the world is safe. It's not safe. Not at all. It's not safe. The fact that you think it's safe means that you were living in an unconscious bubble that was sort of provided to you by your culture. It's a gift. And now that's been shattered. And so now what do you do? Well, the answer is you retreat until you're in your house and there's nowhere you can go. You're the ultimate frozen rabbit, right? And your life is hell because you can't function. The alternative is, let's take apart the things you're afraid of. Let's expose you to them, carefully and programmatically. And then you'll learn that you're actually tougher than you think. You never knew that. And maybe you didn't want to take on the responsibility because, people play a role in their own demise, so to speak. When you had opportunity to go out and explore or withdraw because you were afraid, you chose to withdraw because you were afraid. So it's not only that you were overprotected often, it's that you were willing to take advantage of the fact that you were overprotected and run back there whenever you had the opportunity. So maybe you're a kid in the playground, right, and you're having some trouble with other kids, and in the back of your mind, I should deal with this myself, but you go and tell your mom and get her to intervene. And you know that that's not right. You know that you're breaking the social contract, but it's easier, and so that's what you do. You run off to an authority figure and hide behind the Great Father, right, roughly speaking. Well, the problem with that is you don't learn how to do it yourself. So then you have to relearn it painfully when you're 40. So then you take people out. You say, well, what are you afraid of? Rank it from 1 to 10. So 10 is, we'll make a list of 10 things you're afraid of. The thing you're least afraid of we'll call number 10. So we'll start with that. Okay, well, I'm afraid of elevators. Okay, well, let's look at a picture of an elevator. Let's have you imagine being in an elevator. Let's go out to an elevator and let you watch the terrible jaws of death open, because that's how you're responding to it symbolically, right? And you're going to do that at the closest proximity you can manage. You find out, you go do that, it works. You're nervous as hell, especially from an anticipatory perspective. Shaking. You go out, you stop, you watch it happen, and you actually calm down. You do that 10 times and it no longer bothers you. Well, what you've learned that you didn't die, but more importantly than that, you've learned that you could withstand the threat of death. That's what you've learned. And then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and finally you're back in what's no longer the elevator from a symbolic perspective. It's a tomb, right? It's a place of enclosure and isolation. And you learn, turns out I can withstand that. And then you're much more together, much more confident. And that's often one of the things that often happens in situations like that. I've seen this multiple times, is that if you run someone through an exposure training process like that and toughen them up, they'll often start standing up to people around them in a way they never did before, because they wouldn't stand up for themselves before, because they weren't willing to undermine the protection. See, if you're protecting me, I can't bother you, because I can't afford to forsake your protection. So if I'm going to play that game, I'm going to hide behind you, then I can't challenge you. So that's no good, because that's sometimes why people, you see this with guys very frequently, they're still deathly afraid of their father's judgment when they're in their 30s or 40s. It's like, well, why? No, because they still want to believe that there's someone out there that knows. And so they're willing to accept the subjugation, because it doesn't force them to challenge the idea that there's someone out there that knows. Because that's the advantage of having your father as a judge, right? Because he knows. Well, what if he doesn't? What if no one knows any better than you? Well, that's a rough thing. You don't, until you realize that, you're not an adult, right? That's really technically the point of realization of adulthood, is that no one actually knows what you should do more than you do. I mean, it's a horrible realization, because what the hell do you know? It's a terrible realization, and people will often pick slavery, permanent slavery, to the spirit of the Great Father, let's say, over that realization, and it's completely understandable. But the problem with it is that there's more to you than you think, and so if you continue to hide behind that figure, then you never have a chance to understand that there's more to you than you think, far more to you than you think. Maybe there's enough to you so that you can actually withstand the threat of mortality without collapsing. Maybe even withstand the threat of malevolence without collapsing. Who knows? It's certainly possible. And it's not an abstract question. It's exactly the sort of question that you address in the psychotherapeutic process. It's always the question that you address. And the answer is often in the affirmative, because people can get unbelievably tough. And you know that, because people work in emergency wards in hospitals, right? Or they work in palliative care wards, or they work as mortuary assistants. I mean, these people have bloody rough jobs, you know, or they're on the front line of police investigation into, you know, heinous child abuse crimes, and so they're confronting malevolence on a regular basis. And, you know, those are very stressful jobs, but people do them. And some people do them without even being damaged by them, although that's a harder thing, because you can see horrible things, you know, things you'll never forget.
Locate one of the longer Bruce Lipton audios. The understanding of epigenetics from the expert's perspective is to understand how cortisol, stress, and conflict, specifically the conflict between a boss who's oppressing people and just regular people trying to live, damages us. We literally take cell damage and get diseases because of this stress, and that's one of the main things Bruce Lipton talks about a lot, in addition to the epigenetic idea of reprogramming for creativity. Essentially, his message is the science clarified essence of what the path I've been walking down in the information that I've more or less intuited. He backs up in depth, in long form. So I've been listening to things like this, as well as some just physics audiobooks for additional insomnia cures, but particularly the longer talking content that is out there from Bruce Lipton is incredibly excellent, so I'm going to pull one up for this session, and we will listen. Bruce cells damaged. let's start with this one. This is a 10-minute.
Today we are in a mass extinction, science has recognized. And the significance is it's human behavior that is manifesting this. And what we have to recognize is we have to change our consciousness and our behavior, because our collective consciousness is unfortunately not supporting our viability on this world. When you're in fear, you shut down the growth and maintenance of the body. It's the fear of death is the problem that we must deal with today. We're going from a Darwinian view where there's a struggle, a competition for survival, and it's a very stressful world, to a new world of understanding, a new evolution that recognizes evolution isn't based on competition, it's based on cooperation. And while that's coming down, you can either focus on the breakdown, or you can start to focus on what's new and what we're building. Because if we redirect our attention in that way, then we will be supporting with our consciousness this building of a new civilization, not based on survival, based on thriving into the future. You're seeing the chaos of a breakdown of a civilization that's not sustainable. That's why we're in extinction. That we're creating a community. It's community that is representing evolution. That we're stop focusing on the part that's coming down. And it's time for us to put our energy into what we are building up. We're building a new civilization. We are actually not going to an end, but we're breaking down for a new beginning. And the new beginning is a consciousness, a new image, a new way of behaving, a new way of learning to live in harmony. Consciousness is creating your life experience. What information are you putting in there? Because that information will be translated directly into your biology.
How do we deal with that stress?
Stress hormones shut down the immune system to conserve energy so I can run away from the threat. And I go, it's so powerful at shutting down the immune system that stress hormones are used, listen, therapeutically. If I am going to transplant an organ from one person to another, the recipient of that transplant, their immune system, by definition, is going to try and reject the transplant because it's foreign tissue. I say, so what do doctors do before they transplant an organ? They give the patient stress hormones. Because when they get the stress hormones, it inhibits the immune function from rejecting the graft. My God, stress hormones are so effective at shutting down the immune system that they use it therapeutically to stop the function of that immune system.
Now we're in these strange times as well, that our stress has been exacerbated, not just by the news, but the lockdown and even more. So what's your advice to people?
Well, the first straightforward advice is this: we have to maintain our physiology and our health. You know, it's not that difficult. Eat food that is good for you, not industrial farm, but organic, natural, healthy food. Industrial farm food is loaded with chemicals that influence our system in a very negative way. I mean, all you have to do is look at a farmer out there in those industrial farms spraying the crops. They're all wearing hazard suits. So taking care of your nutrition, number one, is important because we nourish ourselves. And if you shorten the supply of nourishment, of course you're going to be open to sickness. Number two is to take advantage of vitamins and supplements and things to support us because our food isn't that great. Anything we can do outside to enhance our immune system, and let me just add, especially vitamin C. When we support ourselves that way, we strengthen the immune system. And then third thing, watch what you're thinking. Because the moment you are thinking of stressful things like, oh my God, I'm not working for weeks and my job, my salary, do I have any money? Fear comes from that. Can I pay the rent? Am I going to die? Of course, fear comes from that. And I go, these fears are the primary things that inhibit the function of the immune system. It's the fear of death is the problem that we must deal with today. The cells in my body are in a skin-covered petri dish. They're responding to the chemistry of the blood, which is the culture medium, which determines their fate. And then all of a sudden, the most important question, there's two, who's the chemist that puts the chemistry into that blood? The answer is the brain. And then comes the most important question of all. What chemicals should the brain put into the blood? Because if you change the chemicals, you change the fate of the cells. So here's the answer. Whatever picture you hold in your mind, the brain translates that picture into chemistry that complements that picture and puts that chemistry in the blood, and the body responds to the picture in your mind. And I go, why is that relevant? I said, I could have a picture of health, or I could have a picture of fear. I say, well, that's different chemistry. When you're in love, the brain releases love chemistry, which is like dopamine, pleasure. That's why falling in love, oh, it's so great, it's pleasure. It also releases oxytocin, which bonds you to the source of your love. But the big one is this. Growth hormone is released into the blood when you're in love. Then tell me, what is the consequence of a picture of love? I said, the chemistry of the body provides extreme health. I say, well, what's the chemistry that comes out in fear? None of that love chemistry is coming out here. A picture of fear in my mind causes stress hormones, cortisol, things like that, and factors that shut down the immune system. They're called cytokines. And so the blood of a person in love has a different chemistry than the blood of a person in fear. The thing that people have to understand is this. This is like, now comes the critical moment of what? And I say, a cell can be in growth, or a cell can be in protection, but a cell can't be in both at the same time.
You are either refusing infringement and living to find out what you can craft, or you are inflicting death and destruction upon all your cells and going toward collapse, biological collapse. That's the meaning of a social organism, either on a path of reducing harms against any individual to increase the liberty of the entire meta-consciousness that we are, or tyrannical fascism that's just simply deconstructing everyone in the entire society.
Growth, I move to a stimulus like someone. A cell can be in protection, but a cell of a person in love has a different chemistry than the blood of a person in fear. The thing that people have to understand is this. This is like, now comes the critical moment of what? And I say, a cell can be in growth, or a cell can be in protection, but a cell can't be in both at the same time. Growth, I move to a stimulus like someone I love or something I like. I move to it, and I'm open. I take it in. Love, I want to be open. I want to assimilate it. You know, joy, I want it open. I want to take it in. I say, what about protection? I go, oh, if there's a stimulus out there that you are fear of, you don't go to the stimulus, you go away from the stimulus. I say, do you stay open? I say, absolutely not. You close yourself down to protect yourself. Oh my God, you can't do both of those at the same time. And all of a sudden you start to realize our biology is now based on whether we're open to be in love or we're closed because we're in fear. And I say, well, here we are today, ladies and gentlemen. This is the state of fear that is compromising not just your growth and maintenance of your body, but it's shutting off your immune system, opening us to disease.
You know, when I go to my doctor, I go to the hospital, I don't hear this from any of the establishments in medicine. I never hear it's all about chemistry and biology, and no one would ever dare say that my feelings about something, that my visualizations in my life might affect my biology. Why is that?
The reality is, epigenetics is a new science. It's from 1990. Is it in the medical school curriculum? Only within the last couple of years. So I say any doctor who got trained previous to 2 years ago or so has very little, if any, information about epigenetics. Genetics means genes control the character of your life. Epigenetics is the environment controls the genes. If the genes control your life, that belief system, then by definition, we become victims of our heredity. There's a cancer gene in my family and I'm gonna get the cancer. Or cardiovascular, my father died when he was 49, my grandfather died when he was 51. Oh my God, I have those genes, I'm gonna die at 50. And now the new science, epigenetics, say, no, this is completely false. The environment and our consciousness is controlling this. And I say, why is it relevant? Well, if you want to change your biology, then change your consciousness. You don't have to change your genes. The genes aren't in control. With every gene you have in your body, a gene is a blueprint. For every gene blueprint in your body, I can make over 3,000 different versions of the protein from the same blueprint based on the way I respond to life. The genes are just the blueprints. How you use the blueprints and how they're going to function is not based on the genes. It's based on the consciousness. The revolution is, am I controlled by my genes or do I control my genes? The difference is, now that we know we control our genes, and all of a sudden, instead of being victims of our heredity, by definition, we are masters of our heredity, because our consciousness can take any gene and make any kind of copy out of it, a copy that gives me health from the gene blueprint, or based on how I perceive the world and I'm not happy or I'm stressed out, I can make a protein that will take away my health. There's a misunderstanding about genes and victimization. We're all perceived as victims of our heredity when we are absolute masters. We control our genetics, and that's the most important fact that people have to understand.
It all comes together in this thought that if you gain awareness, you harness the awareness toggle, allowing you to harness the generative intelligence, the creative consciousness, you will manifest well-being and the good XP, the sensation of joy and of excellence that is pointed to in Zen. And throughout everything that I've ever made or pursued about creativity and about play, play is the secret to health. You must overturn stress and worry and dread and come to a place where your happy place is, and build your entire mechanism of ritual, of life, around that joy, around that expression of your truth. That is the only way to manifest health. You literally possess biological equipment that is for this purpose. That is what it does. That's what this machine does, that our consciousness substance is flowing within and operating. It's an electrical bio machine.